Glass shatters on porch boards, then a slap flat, sharp, louder than a gunshot at high noon. The whole street goes silent. The girl doesn't fall, doesn't step back. Her head turns with the blow, then turns back slowly, the way a door closes, and her right hand has already slid to her hip, reaching for something that isn't there. Her fingers curl around nothing, then open, fall to her side, so still that nobody catches what almost happened. Nobody except one man. In the darkest corner of the saloon, at the table with 3 legs propped up by a folded piece of leather, an old man sets down his whiskey. His hand shakes. Not from age. 3 weeks he's been sitting there, watching, waiting. Outside, the desert sun presses down on the rooftops like a hand that doesn't plan to lift. The girl crouches, picks up the broken glass, piece by piece, unhurried, and not one soul in this town knows her real name. The sun hit Copperhead Flats like it had a grudge. Not the gentle kind. Not the warmth that dries laundry and sweetens fruit on the vine. This was Arizona territory in October of 1882, and the sun here was a different animal entirely. It pressed down on the rooftops like a hand that didn't plan to lift. It sucked the moisture from the air before you could breathe it in. It turned the main street into something that shimmered at the edges, uncertain of its own existence. Like a mirage that hadn't quite decided whether to disappear. The town looked like it had been nailed together in a hurry, and never quite forgiven for it. Copperhead Flats sat in a shallow valley carved by a creek that only ran in spring. The mountains to the east were the color of rust and old blood. The mountains to the west caught the last light of evening and held it too long. The way a man holds onto a bottle he knows is empty. Between those mountains, the town stretched itself along one main road. Call it a street if you were being generous. Buildings that leaned slightly into each other like men at a bar who'd lost the will to stand straight. There was a hardware store, a general goods, a livery stable that smelled exactly as you'd expect, a barber shop where the barber also pulled teeth and charged extra for the privilege, a church at the far north end that hosted services on Sundays, and a poker game on Wednesdays. And the preacher had made his peace with that particular arrangement years ago. And there was the Pale Horse Saloon. 2 stories, wood the color of old tobacco, a porch that ran the full length of the front, held up by 2 posts the way 2 tired men hold up a fence. Committed, but not enthusiastic. The sign above the door had been painted by someone with an interesting relationship with whiskey, and the horse on that sign bore only a passing resemblance to an actual horse. Nobody complained. The sign said Pale Horse. Everybody knew where it was. That was enough. It was almost noon. The street outside was alive with the energy of a copper mining town in the middle of its boom. Men moved with purpose. Wagons loaded with supplies for the mines out east. A mule team struggling with something heavy. 2 men in suits. Eastern suits. Wrong for the climate. Wrong for the dust. Standing near the land office with papers in their hands, and the careful expressions of men calculating something they didn't want anyone else to know they were calculating. Copper had come to this part of Arizona territory, the way gold came to California, the way silver came to Nevada, loud, fast, dragging everything else behind it. The Southern Pacific Railroad had pushed its iron rails into Arizona the year before, 1881. And with the railroad came the organized money, the kind that didn't ride in on horseback and sleep under the stars, the kind that wore Eastern suits and stood near land offices with papers. The mines needed men. The men needed food and drink and somewhere to spend their wages. The town obliged. Everybody was getting something from somebody. The whole arrangement hummed along with the particular efficiency of mutual exploitation, except for the families who'd been there before the copper boom. But that's a different part of the story. Right now it's almost noon. The street is busy. The sun is pressing down. And a young woman is pushing through the front door of the Pale Horse Saloon with a tray balanced in her left hand. 3 glasses on it. Full. Moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who has carried heavy things for a long time and learned to make it look like nothing. Her name, as far as anyone in Copperhead Flats knew, was just Girl. Some of the regulars called her that to her face. Some had the basic decency to say Miss. The kinder ones called her Ma'am, which she accepted without comment the same way she accepted everything else in this town. Without comment, without visible reaction, with a face that gave nothing away and eyes that were doing something entirely different from what her face suggested. Those eyes, brown, mostly, with something in them that caught the light at certain angles and held it, not in a warm way. The way old amber holds a trapped insect, preserved still, a little unsettling if you look too close. Most people didn't look too close. Most people saw what the situation offered. A young woman in her middle 20s, slight, maybe 5'3" in her boots, dark hair pulled back with the pragmatism of someone who didn't have time for it to be in her face. A capable girl, quiet, efficient, nothing remarkable. That was the most dangerous thing about her. She stepped out onto the porch with those 3 glasses and headed for the table at the near end. 2 miners, 1 foreman. An argument about something nobody would care about tomorrow. She was 3 steps from the table when it happened. Fast. The way everything that changes a life happens. Fast and stupid and utterly ordinary. Wade Merritt came around the corner of the porch at speed. The way young men with money and no consequences tend to move. Like the world is a hallway built specifically for their passage. 24 years old. Broad through the shoulders, narrow through the mind. The kind of handsome that had probably gotten him out of trouble more often than it should have. Hat pushed back, boots recently polished, shirt clean, which in a copper mining town at noon was itself a statement about who he thought he was. He wasn't watching where he was going, she was, but watching where someone is going and stopping them from getting there are 2 different skills, and the tray in her hands made the second one impossible. His shoulder caught hers. Not deliberate. Just the blunt physics of a large man not paying attention. The tray tilted. The 3 glasses went. And the sound they made hitting the porch boards was that particular crash that silences every conversation within 30 feet, which is what happened. Conversation stopping. Heads turning. The 2 miners, the foreman, 3 men at the nearest rail. A woman crossing the street below. All of them. Heads up. Eyes on the porch. Wade Merritt looked down at the broken glass and the spreading amber stain. He looked at his shirt. Clean no longer. He looked at the tray on the ground. He looked up at her, and he hit her. Open hand. Across the left side of her face. The sound of it was flat and sharp and very loud in the sudden quiet. The kind of sound that doesn't echo so much as settle. Like a stone dropped into still water. Her head turned with it. Her body didn't move. Her feet didn't shift. She absorbed it the way a fence post absorbs a blow. By being rooted in something the blow couldn't reach. 1 second. 2. She slowly turned her head back. Her right hand had moved. Nobody watching could have told you exactly when. It was just there, and then it wasn't, and then it was again. Touching something at her hip that wasn't there. Finding the absence of it. Her fingers curled around nothing, registered nothing. And her hand came back to her side, with a steadiness that was more controlled than any emotion showing in her face. Which was nothing. Her face was showing nothing at all. Wade was already talking. The way men like him talk after something like that. Loud. Filling the silence before it fills with something they don't want to hear. Watch where you're going. Look at my damn shirt. She looked at the shirt. Looked at the broken glass. Looked at the spreading stain on the boards. Then she crouched down, unhurried. The way she did everything. And began picking up the larger pieces of glass. Carefully. Like she had all the time in the world, and none of it was being spent on anything as wasteful as anger. Wade stared at the top of her head for a moment. Then he stepped over her and walked through the saloon door. The conversations resumed. Slowly. Then fully. The way water closes over a stone. She gathered the glass, set it on the tray, stood up, looked out at the street without seeing it. Then she went back inside. But here's what nobody watching from the street saw. Because nobody was watching the right thing. In the corner of the Pale Horse Saloon. The far corner. The one that caught the least light, even at midday. Where the table had 3 legs instead of 4 and was propped up by a folded piece of leather. An old man was sitting. He'd been sitting there every afternoon for 3 weeks. Long enough that Ruth Gaines, who owned the Pale Horse and had categorized her regulars with the efficiency of a woman who'd been doing this for 11 years, had begun to think of him as part of the furniture. He drank 1 whiskey. Sometimes 2, never 3. Didn't gamble. Didn't make conversation. Didn't seem to want anything from anyone. He watched, not obviously. Not in the way of a man who wanted to be seen watching. In the way of a man who had spent enough years watching that it had stopped being a deliberate act and become something more like breathing. When the crash happened on the porch, he looked up. When the slap landed, something moved across his face. Just briefly. Not quite a wince. Not quite guilt. Something older than both. The kind of expression a man makes when he sees something he expected, but had been hoping wouldn't happen yet. He watched her walk back in through the door. Tray in hand. Glass cleaned up. Face composed. He watched her the way you watch someone you've been watching for a long time from a careful distance. Then he picked up his whiskey glass, set it down, picked it up again. His right hand was shaking, just slightly. Not from age, or not entirely from age. It was the kind of shaking that comes from something a man is still carrying. Something heavy. Something he has been carrying so long that the weight has become part of how he stands, part of how he breathes. His name was Cal Briggs. He set his glass down, folded both hands on the table, and kept watching. The town of Copperhead Flats, in the fall of 1882, was a place worth understanding, because a story lives in its place. And this place had more going on beneath its surface than most. The copper had been there for centuries. The Apache knew it. The Spanish knew it. The Mexicans who came after them knew it. But knowing something is in the ground and having the means to pull it out at scale are two entirely different propositions. And it wasn't until the Southern Pacific pushed its iron rails into Arizona territory that pulling copper out at scale became something a man could get very rich doing very quickly. The railroad changed everything. Before 1881, the copper was there, but getting it anywhere was the problem. Mules and wagons across desert terrain. Expensive, slow. After the railroad, you could pull it out of the mountains east of Copperhead Flats, process it, load it, and have it headed toward Tucson and the smelters and the factories in the east, all within a week. All of a sudden, the math worked. All of a sudden, there was money in that dirt. Douglas Merritt had understood the math before almost anyone else. 57 years old. He had the look of a man who had been right about enough things in his life that being right had stopped feeling like luck and started feeling like a personal quality. Not a large man physically. Medium height. Medium build. The kind of frame that suits wear well without calling attention to itself. His hair had gone silver a decade ago, and he'd decided to let it. The watch on his chain came out 3-4 times a day. Not because he needed to know the time, because it was his. And he liked to confirm the things that were his. He owned the Copperhead Bank. On the surface, that was straightforward. The town needed a bank. He built one. He provided loans to miners, merchants, the families who'd been here before the boom, and now needed capital to survive the changes the boom brought. He charged interest. He collected payments. Standard. But the thing about Douglas Merritt was that he understood something. Most honest bankers don't think about carefully. He understood that a man who owes you money is not your customer. He is your leverage. The loan contracts he drew up were written by Tucson lawyers he kept on retainer. Those contracts contained language that was technically legal, technically within the statutes of Arizona territory law, and practically impossible for a farmer or rancher to fully understand without their own lawyers, which they generally didn't have. The contracts contained clauses about what constituted a default, and those clauses were written with a particular flexibility. Flexible toward Merritt, not toward the man holding the paper. When Merritt needed something from someone. Land, mainly. Always land. Because the Southern Pacific needed land for sidings and loading facilities. And the company that controlled that land controlled the flow of copper coming out of these mountains. He would find the right clause in the right contract and declare a default. The borrower could dispute it in court. The Territory Circuit Court judge was a man named Aldous Carr, and Judge Carr had a particular relationship with Douglas Merritt that was not reflected in any official document anywhere. Frank Kane had known about Judge Carr. That was the problem, but that's not where we are yet either. She had been in Copperhead Flats for 14 months, arrived in August of 1881, 3 weeks after the Southern Pacific completed its run through the territory. On a day when the heat was bad enough that the few people who noticed her arrival were too occupied with their own discomfort to wonder about hers. Stage from Tucson. 1 bag. Practical clothes. No jewelry, no obvious money. She walked into the Pale Horse and asked Ruth Gaines for a job. Ruth Gaines was 52 years old and had been running this saloon since her husband Arthur, who had been considerable in several respects and reliable in none of them, died of a misadventure involving a steep trail and an overconfident horse in the spring of 1873. Ruth had not mourned Arthur with the theatricality the town expected. She had taken stock of what he'd left her. The saloon and its debts and 2 mules and a dog. She decided the saloon was viable if managed properly. The debts manageable if she was careful. The mules an asset. The dog a comfort. And she set about building something that was hers. 11 years later, the Pale Horse was the most reliably profitable business in Copperhead Flats. Not the loudest, just the most consistent. Clean glasses, honest pours, a kitchen that served 3 things: beef stew, beans, and cornbread, but served them better than anywhere else in the valley. When the woman walked in and asked for a job, Ruth looked at her for about 15 seconds. You done bar work before? No. Can you cook? Adequately. Can you carry a tray without spilling? Yes. You got a name? A brief pause, just brief enough to notice if you were paying attention. Nora. Nora what? Just Nora works fine. Ruth looked at her 5 more seconds. Named a fair wage. Described the room upstairs. Outlined the hours. Said she could start tomorrow. She never asked about the last name again. That was 14 months ago. In those 14 months, she had become part of the Pale Horse, the way a load-bearing wall becomes part of a building. Structurally essential, rarely noticed. Impossible to remove without consequences. She worked the floor from noon until 10. She kept the glasses moving and the conversations from spilling into violence, with an efficiency Ruth admired without being able to articulate. Something about the way she moved through a crowded room. Something about how she could appear at the elbow of a conversation getting loud, set down a fresh round, and redirect the momentum of the thing without anyone being able to say exactly how she'd done it. Quiet, not shy. There's a difference. Quiet in the way of a woman who had decided that most conversations were not worth the cost of participating in them. Nobody in Copperhead Flats knew where she'd come from. Nobody knew she slipped out every morning before anyone else was awake. If they had followed her, and nobody did, they would have walked east along the creek bed until the town was out of sight, through a stand of mesquite that gave way to open ground backed by a low ridge of volcanic rock, black and rough-edged in the pre-dawn dark. There was a crack in that ridge, about 50 feet wide and 20 deep. Not quite a canyon, a notch. The kind of formation that caught sound and held it, and sent it back in interesting ways. Every morning in that notch, Nora Kane practiced the things that keep a person alive. Winchester Model 1873. Lever action. 0.4440 caliber. Kept wrapped in canvas behind a specific rock she'd never shown anyone. 2 boxes of cartridges rationed with careful precision. The Winchester held 15 rounds. She loaded 15. Set 12 targets. Tin cans mostly. A few pieces of wood, cut to specific sizes. 1 battered tin plate at 160 feet that required everything she had on a bad morning, and most of what she had on a good one. All 15 rounds into targets in under 2 minutes. Not the easy ones, all of them. She adjusted for light, for wind coming down through the notch, for the cold that made her fingers slightly less certain. She corrected mistakes without drama. Noted, adjusted, fired again. Then she walked back to town, in through the kitchen door before Ruth was down. Started the coffee, was behind the bar when the first customer arrived. Nobody saw her do this. In her room on the 2nd floor, under the 3rd board, from the left as you came through the door. A board she'd loosened in her first week and replaced carefully so it sat flush and looked untouched. She kept a Colt single-action Army revolver, 0.45 caliber. The bluing on the barrel worn in 2 specific places. The grip replaced at some point with darker wood. Custom fitted. Worn smooth from handling. The action clean. Maintained every few days with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything. She had never drawn that gun in Copperhead Flats. Not once in 14 months. The restraint this required. The daily, ongoing, bone-deep discipline of not reaching for the thing she'd been trained since childhood to reach for. It was there. In the way her right hand sometimes moved without permission when something startled her. In the way she cataloged exits when she entered a room. In the way she knew at all times the position of every person in the Pale Horse. She was waiting. She had been waiting for a very long time. The afternoon after the slap, the saloon was busy. Shift change at the Coldwater. Mine east of town brought 24 men in off the road with their wages and their thirst and their accumulated grievances about the foreman, the ore quality, the heat, and each other. The pale horse accommodated them with practiced ease. Ruth behind the bar, Nora on the floor, carrying, managing, occasionally intercepting. There was a bruise on her left cheekbone. Not large, a shadow mostly, the kind of mark that would be invisible tomorrow, and was only visible today if you knew to look. Most of the miners didn't know to look. One man did. Old Vickers, a miner who'd been working the same claim for 3 years. The particular dignity of a man who'd outlasted most of what he'd expected to outlast. He held out his hand when she set down his beer. "You all right, miss?" She measured the question, decided it deserved a real answer. "I'm fine, Vickers. Thank you for asking." "That Merritt boy is a young man who will face appropriate consequences in his own time," said pleasantly, precisely, like she'd considered the exact phrasing and found it satisfactory. Vickers looked at her a moment, then nodded and picked up his beer. He didn't ask again. In the far corner, Cal Briggs nursed his whiskey. He'd been watching the bruise, not openly, the way he watched everything in this room, as a fact to be noted, filed, considered for what it meant beyond itself. The bruise meant Wade Merritt had miscalculated something. Men who hit women in broad daylight in front of witnesses had stopped being careful. Men who stopped being careful started making other mistakes. The timing was getting tight. Cal was 66 years old. The past 4 years had made him feel every one of those years, in a way the previous 62 had not. He had bad days and worse days, and rare good days when his hand didn't shake and his knee didn't seize on the stairs, and he could still, if pressed, move with something approximating the efficiency he'd had in his 30s. But pressing was getting rarer. He looked across the room at her. Iron Frank's daughter, 27 years old. He'd known her when she was a child. Not well, not closely, but enough. He'd watched from careful distance as she grew up and fell out of the world and landed here. In this town, this saloon, this situation. He'd been watching her for 3 weeks, trying to decide if she was what he thought she was, or if he was an old man who saw what he wanted to see. He'd made up his mind. She was exactly what he thought she was. He reached into his coat pocket, took out something small, held it in his palm, then closed his fist around it. Not yet, she knew he was watching. She'd known since his 3rd day in the saloon. It wasn't the watching itself she noticed first. Plenty of people watched her in the various ways men watch women in saloons, and she'd become expert at distinguishing between them. This was different. The direction of it was different. He wasn't watching her the way a man watches a woman. He was watching her the way a man watches a road, looking for what was coming down it. She'd made it a point to stay out of his corner, not because she was afraid of him. Fear was a useful tool, and she'd learned to use it properly. Acknowledge it, respect it, decline to let it make decisions. She wasn't afraid of a 66-year-old man with a shaking hand who drank 1 whiskey a day and never made trouble. She was careful of him, which was different. Careful was respectful. Careful was honest. Fear told you to run. Careful told you to think. She'd thought about him for 3 weeks. Noted the Smith & Wesson Schofield at his hip. A gun that said lawman more than outlaw. A particular preference of U.S. Marshals and their deputies in the 70s. Noted the hitch in his right knee that came from old injury rather than age. Noted that he never tried to talk to her. Never manufactured a reason to be near her. Just watched and drank his whiskey and waited. He was waiting for something. She was increasingly certain she knew what it was, which was the thing she hadn't let herself think about directly. Not in 14 months. She'd gotten very good at not thinking about things directly. She thought around them, maintained awareness of the shape of a thought without looking at it straight on. The way you look at stars, peripherally, because direct attention makes them disappear. The thought she'd been not looking for 14 months was approximately this. She had not come to Copperhead Flats by accident. She had come because Douglas Merritt was here. She had come because, 4 years ago, something happened. Someone made a decision for her she had not been consulted about. She had been living with the consequences of that decision ever since, and she had determined, not with anger, or not only with anger, but with the particular cold clarity that comes after anger has burned itself out and left the bones, that she would find her own way to the end of this story. She just needed the right moment. and she needed to know what an old man in a corner knew about her father. That evening, after the crowd thinned and before the late men drifted in, there was a period of about an hour when the pale horse went quiet. The breathing hour, Ruth called it privately. When she wiped down the bar and let herself exist for 60 minutes as something other than the proprietor of this establishment. Nora used the hour to do the washing up. She was in the kitchen working through the stack of glasses when she heard the particular creak of the fourth step from the bottom, which she had cataloged in her first week. Heavy, deliberate, not trying to be quiet. She kept washing the glass in her hands. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway, apron off, unusual for this hour, holding a cup of coffee the way she held things when she was organizing thoughts around something difficult. Your face, Ruth said. It's fine. I know it's fine. I can see it's fine. That's not what I'm talking about. Nora set the clean glass down, picked up another. Sit down a minute, Ruth said. I have glasses too. Nora. Something in the way she said the name, not sharp, not commanding, just weighted. The way a name gets weighted when a person is using it to carry something heavier than the name itself. Nora set the glass down, turned, sat at the kitchen table. Ruth sat across from her, set the coffee down, looked at her. I've got something I should have given you a while ago. I've been deciding when, and I've been deciding wrong. Tonight feels like the time. She reached into the pocket of her dress, took out a small bundle. Papers, folded, held together with a piece of twine, gone soft with age and handling. Set it on the table between them. Nora looked at it. Did not touch it. What is that? Not quite a question. The flatness of someone who suspects they already know. Been receiving money, Ruth said. Every month since you got here. Posted from somewhere different each time. Tucson. Benson. Once from Albuquerque. No return name. Amount's always the same. $30. Nora's hands were very still on the table. $30 a month. With a note the first time. Just said, keep her safe. Don't ask her name. That was all. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside someone was playing a harmonica badly. A dog barked twice and stopped. 14 months, Nora said. Since a week before you arrived. Whoever sent it knew I was coming. Yes. She looked at the bundle of papers. $420 represented there. 14 monthly payments from someone who knew her direction before she did, who had arranged in advance for her to have shelter and safety, and a face that asked no questions. Someone who knew her. You could have told me. Quiet. Not accusatory. Just noting a fact. I could have. Ruth wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I didn't. Because the note said keep her safe and I decided that keeping you from knowing this was part of that. Maybe I was wrong. I've been thinking for a while now that I was wrong. Another silence. Longer. What changed your mind? Old man in the corner. Been here 3 weeks. He watches you like he's waiting for permission to say something. He knows something. And if he knows something, you should know it first. Nora nodded. Once. Small. Controlled. She reached out and picked up the bundle of papers. Didn't open it. Just held it, feeling the weight. The accumulated weight of 14 months and $30 a month, and someone's decision to take care of her without her knowledge or consent. Something moved through her. Not gratitude. Not yet. Something adjacent to it. Something more complicated. Something that made her suddenly aware of how alone she had been in a way she hadn't let herself fully know until this moment. This kitchen. This proof that somewhere, someone had been paying attention. She set the bundle down. Stood. Pushed the kitchen chair back under the table. Thank you, Ruth, for telling me. What are you going to do? Nora put the bundle in her apron pocket. Sleep on it. Which wasn't true, but it was the kind of answer that ended a conversation kindly, and she had learned to value that. She didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed with the bundle of papers in her lap, and the lamp turned low, and the sounds of the late-night pale horse drifting up through the floor, the last of the drinkers. A muffled argument about nothing. A chair scraping. The door. She opened the papers and spread them out on the bed. 14 receipts. Ruth's handwriting on each one. Date received. Amount. Source location. Tucson. Benson. Tombstone once. Oracle. Albuquerque. The locations scattered in a pattern that suggested movement. Not settlement. Someone moving around. Someone who didn't stay in one place long enough to be found. And the first note. In a different hand. 2 lines. Keep her safe. Don't ask her name. She knew the handwriting, had known it since she was 8 years old, sitting at a kitchen table with a lamp and her father's hand guiding hers over the letters. The particular way the K was made, slightly angular at the top, a flourish that was more habit than intention, the way the G descended, the flat practical cross on the T. She had known the handwriting, and she had not let herself know that she knew it for the full 30 seconds she'd been looking at the note, because knowing it changed everything, and she had been very carefully managing what changed and when. But now, she looked at it for a long time, until the lamp began to flicker as the oil ran low, and even then she looked at it. Her father had known she was coming. Her father, who was dead, who had been dead for 4 years, who she had spent 4 years building an architecture around, a whole internal edifice of grief and purpose and anger and direction built on the foundational fact of his absence, had been alive, had known where she was going, had arranged for her protection, had not appeared, had stayed away. The went out. She sat in the dark. This was the thing she was going to need to think about very carefully. Not now. Now she was going to file it in the same careful internal storage where she kept all the things she'd been managing through patience. But soon, very soon, she was going to have to take this out and look at it directly. And she was going to have to decide what it meant about everything she thought she knew. But first, there was an old man in the corner of the saloon. Old man with a Smith & Wesson and a shaking hand, and the watching eyes of someone who had been a lawman, and the expression of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and was looking for someone trustworthy enough to hand it to. She needed to know what he knew before she decided what she knew. That was the first step. She folded the papers and put them in the inner pocket of her coat, close to her chest, where she could feel them. Then she lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling until it got light. Morning. Before the town was awake, she was already in the notch loading the Winchester. But this morning was different. She loaded the rifle, and then stood with it at her side for a moment, looking at the targets she'd set, the tin cans, the piece of wood, the battered plate. She wasn't thinking about the targets. She was thinking about what her father had taught her, and why. She could remember it clearly. The kitchen of the house in New Mexico Territory, the smell of pine resin and gun oil. His voice, which was not a large voice but a precise one. He'd said, "A gun is a tool, like a hammer, like a knife. You learn to use a hammer so you can build a house. You learn to use this so you can stay alive long enough to build the house." She'd been 9 years old, maybe 10, holding the unloaded Colt in both hands, feeling the weight of it. He'd said, "The day you pull it because you're angry, or because you're afraid, or because someone hurt your pride, that's the day it stops being a tool and starts being a problem. You hear me?" She heard him. Standing in the notch, 4 years after the day she'd been told he was dead, holding the Winchester, she heard him as clearly as if he were standing behind her, which meant he wasn't dead, which meant everything. She raised the rifle, sighted, breathed out slow and steady, the way her lungs knew without instruction now, fired. 13 targets, 15 rounds, no misses. 2 seconds of empty between each one. Just long enough to breathe. Just long enough to confirm. She lowered the rifle, looked out, over the notch, over the gray morning scrubland, over the low hills to the southeast where Copperhead Flats was waking up and not yet knowing what the next few days were going to bring. She wrapped the Winchester in its canvas sheet, put it back behind its rock, walked back toward town in the cool gray of the early morning. Boots quiet on the dry ground, hands loose at her sides. The pale horse would be starting to smell like coffee and wood smoke. Cal Briggs would come in at 2:30, and she would be there, with questions, and with the particular patient, dangerous readiness of a woman who had been nobody for 14 months on purpose, and who was about to decide that the time for nobody was over. He was there at his usual time, 2:30. The pale horse, in its midday lull. The lunch crowd gone. The evening crowd not yet arrived. 3 men playing cards in the middle of the room. A traveling salesman at the bar, staring at nothing. Cal Briggs came in, same corner, same table. Ruth set down his whiskey without being asked. Nora watched him from across the room. He sat. He didn't look at her. He wrapped his hands around the glass and looked at the surface of the liquid in it, with the attention of a man who wasn't seeing the whiskey at all. She walked over. No tray. Nothing to set down, nothing to pretend. She just walked over and stood at the edge of his table and waited. He looked up. His eyes were gray. Not pale watery gray. Dense and dark. They looked at her with an expression she could only describe later as old grief that had been working on itself for a long time. She pulled out the chair opposite him, sat down, put her hands flat on the table. Neither of them said anything for several seconds. Then she reached into her apron pocket and put the bundle of papers on the table between them. The 14 receipts, the note in her father's handwriting. Cal looked at the papers, looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Relief, complicated by something darker. You know the handwriting. Not a question. Yes. He reached into his coat pocket, took out something small and set it on the table next to the papers. A photograph. Small. Formal. The kind taken in a studio with a painted backdrop. 2 people in it. A man. Large. Square-shouldered. Wearing a marshal's badge that caught the light. A girl beside him. Maybe 7 or 8 years old. Wearing a dress that looked like it had been put on for the photograph and never worn before. She looked at the photograph. The girl had her hands folded in her lap in a very specific way. Not natural. Not the folded hands of a child at rest. The deliberate folded hands of a child who had been told to keep her hands still and was working hard at it. She looked at her own hands flat on the table. Old habit. Still working. How long have you been watching me? Since you rode in. Cal picked up his glass, set it down without drinking. 14 months, give or take. You're the one sending the money. Pause. Slightly too long. No, I'm not. She looked at him steadily. Then who? He looked back at her. And in the way he looked, the weight of it. The particular combination of guilt and resolution in a 66-year-old face that had seen enough to know what things cost. She knew. She knew, and she needed him to say it. Because knowing and hearing were different things. And she had been waiting for long enough that she deserved to hear it. I think, she said carefully, that you should tell me what you know. Cal Briggs looked at his whiskey. Looked at the photograph. Looked at her. Yeah. Quietly. I think I probably should. He set the glass down. He folded his shaking hands together on the table. And he began. His full name was Calvin Roy Briggs. He had been a deputy U.S. Marshal under the jurisdiction of the District of Arizona for 9 years, from 1870 until 1879. He had ridden under 2 U.S. Marshals in that time, served warrants in 3 territories, testified in federal court 14 times, been shot on 3 occasions, one of which had done permanent damage to his right knee. Another had nicked something in his right hand that had never quite healed correctly, which explained the shaking. He had ridden with Iron Frank Kane for the last 4 of those 9 years. Frank's right hand. The man Frank called first when there was work to be done. The last man standing between Frank and whatever was trying to kill him on a given day. There had been considerable things trying to kill Frank Kane over those 4 years. Frank was the kind of lawman who made enemies in direct proportion to his effectiveness. And the enemies he made were generally not the small-scale kind. He went after the men behind the men. The ones who stayed clean because they paid others not to be. The ones who wore suits instead of leather and kept ledgers instead of wanted posters and were, in Frank's estimation, more dangerous than any outlaw with a gun because they had more to protect and more means to protect it. He had been building a case against Douglas Merritt for 2 years, meticulously, without drama, without shortcuts, with a patience Cal had sometimes found maddening and always ultimately trusted. He had documentation of 3 land transactions that violated territorial statutes. A sworn statement from a bank clerk regarding the terms of certain loan contracts. The beginning of something's much larger. Something that touched Judge Carr. Touched 2 men in the territorial legislature. Touched the financial arrangements that made Douglas Merritt's operations possible. He had been close. 2 years of work, and he had been close. And then on a night in late September of 1878, they had been riding back from a meeting in Benson, a meeting with the clerk who had given them the sworn statement, on a stretch of road 15 miles northeast of Tombstone, on a trail through low hills. Someone had been waiting. 4 men, maybe 5. It had been dark, and it happened fast. Cal's voice was steady as he told this. He had told it to himself enough times in the private courts of his own conscience that the words came without visible emotion. But his hands, his folded hands on the table, were white at the knuckles. The first shot hit Frank's horse. The second hit Frank. Cal had returned fire. Hit someone. He didn't know who. Never found out, and then. This was the part he told in a single flat sentence without elaboration. Because there was no elaboration that made it better. He had run. He had run. Not because he was a coward. Or not entirely. Or not in the way he'd spent 4 years trying to decide. He'd been grazed on the shoulder, and the horse was spooked, and the dark was complete, and he had made in the fraction of a second. That was all the time available a calculation that staying meant dying without result. And he had run. He'd ridden until the sound stopped, and then kept riding until the horse couldn't anymore. Spent the rest of that night in a wash 10 miles from where it happened. Back against a rock, gun in his hand, shoulder bleeding. The knowledge of what he'd done settling over him like weather. At first light, he'd gone back. No bodies, no sign. Tracks that the wind had already started to cover. Frank Kane, for all the evidence available to Cal Briggs in the early morning of late September 1878, had simply ceased to exist. Cal had filed a report. Frank had been declared dead in the line of duty. The investigation into Douglas Merritt had been assigned to another deputy, a man named Hoskins, who had not had 2 years of careful preparation and who had consequently found nothing, which was exactly what Merritt had arranged for. Cal had resigned his commission 3 weeks later. He had been carrying the night on that road for 4 years. She listened to all of this without moving, without a single visible reaction. Not to the ambush, not to the running, not to the word resigned, spoken quietly by a man looking at the table instead of at her. She listened with the same careful stillness she brought to everything that mattered, storing it, letting it settle where it needed to settle. When Cal finished, the saloon had gotten quieter around them. The card game had broken up. The salesman had left. Ruth was at the far end of the bar with her back to the room. He survived, she said. Not a question. Yes, you knew he survived. Not right away. 2 years later, I got word through someone I trusted. He was alive, injured but alive. He'd made it to a ranch east of Tucson. Spent months recovering. And then he didn't come back. No, because of me. Cal looked at her then, directly. The way he'd been careful not to look at her until now. He sent me a message 4 years ago, after I found out he was alive. Said Merritt knew about you, that you existed, that you were his, that you could be used against him. He said the only way to protect you was for Merritt to believe Frank was gone, for everyone to believe it, including you. The room was very quiet. He decided that. She said it quietly, without asking me. You were 23. I was 23. Not 8. Not a child. Cal had nothing to say to that. There was nothing to say to that. He's been sending the money, she said. Every month. Through me, routed so it can't be traced back. He gave me the list of locations. Told me where to post it from each month. He moves around. Doesn't stay. Where is he now? Cal reached into his coat. A folded piece of paper, newer than the photograph. He unfolded it, set it on the table. An address written in 2 lines. 30 miles southwest of Copperhead Flats. A descriptive landmark. A specific canyon. A time of day when someone would be there if you came looking. And beneath the address, in the handwriting she knew, when she's ready, not before. She read it twice. When she's ready. 4 years. 14 months in this town. 3 weeks watching the old man in the corner come to his decision. $30 a month from a man who thought the most important thing he could do for her was stay dead. She folded the paper, put it in her pocket with the receipts. You ran, she said, that night. Yes. And you've been deciding what to do about it for 4 years. Yes. Why now? Why here? Cal was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands. Because Merritt is about to do something that can't be undone. He's moving on the last 8 families. The ones with land that sits between the mine and the railroad siding he wants us. He's going to start the foreclosure proceedings. Once those papers are filed, once the land changes hands, the families are gone. They won't come back. The money will have flowed, the legal mechanisms will have operated, and nothing that comes after will change what was taken. He looked up. And because I'm 66 years old, and my hand shakes, and I can't do this alone. And I've been sitting in this corner for 3 weeks deciding if you were who I thought you were. And you're exactly who I thought you were. She looked at him steadily. A long moment. 3 days, she said. At most. She stood up, straightened her apron, picked up his empty whiskey glass from the table. He blinked. That's it? That's all you? I need to think. I need the night. She looked at him, Come back tomorrow at the same time. I'll have questions. She walked back to the bar, set the glass down, looked at the far wall of the Pale Horse for a moment. The name she carried in this town was nobody's name. The name she'd been born with was waiting for her 30 miles southwest in the handwriting of a man she'd thought was dead. 3 days. She picked up a clean glass, began to dry it. 3 days was enough time, she hoped. That night, she took the Colt from under the floorboard and held it in the lamplight without immediately putting it back. Sat on the edge of the bed with the gun in her hands, turning it over slowly. The worn bluing, the custom grip, dark wood, smooth from handling. The action she knew as well as she knew her own breathing. Her father had given her this gun. Not this specific gun. This one she'd acquired herself through a chain of transactions she'd been careful to make untraceable. Because her father's guns were known. But the same model, same specifications, same weight in her hands. He had handed her his peacemaker for the first time when she was 9 years old. He had said, "This is a tool. It is not a solution." He had said, "The day you need to use it, you'll know. Not because you're afraid, not because you're angry, because there is no other way, and you've looked for one, and you've been honest about your looking." She looked at the gun. Was there another way? She turned the question over with the same care she turned the gun. Honest. She was trying to be honest. She had come to Copperhead Flats to find Douglas Merritt. To find him, and to what? She had spent 4 years building toward this destination without being entirely clear about the destinations itself. She had told herself it was justice, evidence, documentation, the proper channels, her father's way. But underneath that, in the place where honest things lived, there had always been the other answer, the simpler one, the one a Colt 0.45 could provide in a fraction of a second. Was that what she was here for? She didn't know. She put the gun back, replaced the board, pressed it down until it sat flush. She lay down, stared at the ceiling. 3 days. She needed to know what she was going to do before 3 days were up. She closed her eyes. Outside, the last harmonica player of the evening gave up and went to bed. The town settled into its quiet, and for the first time in 4 years, she let herself think her father's name. Frank. Frank Kane. Iron Frank. Still alive. Still deciding things for her. She would have words with him about that. But first, she was going to finish what he'd started. Her way. The next morning, the town woke up, not knowing anything had changed. That was the thing about towns, like Copperhead Flats. They woke up the same way every morning. The rooster at the livery that nobody owned but everybody tolerated. The first smoke from the bakery chimney, 2 doors down from the general goods. The sound of mine wagons starting east before the sun was fully committed to rising. The creak and groan of wheel and axle carrying men toward the mountain in the dark blue hour before proper daylight. Ordinary. All of it ordinary. And she was already in the notch, loading the Winchester, watching the gray sky lighten over the ridge, thinking about a man she'd believed was dead. 15 rounds. She set the targets at their usual positions. The tin cans, the wood piece, the rusted plate at 160 feet. He knew I was coming. He arranged me. She raised the rifle, breathed, fired. The tin can at 40 feet exploded off its rock in a small aluminum clatter. She worked the lever. Next target. Next breath. The rhythm of it, the same rhythm she'd been practicing for years. Her body running the sequence while her mind ran something else entirely. The 2 tracks parallel. Neither one interfering. He chose to protect me over being my father. Cal said that like it was a reasonable thing a reasonable man might do. Like it was a trade-off that made sense if you arranged the variables correctly. The wood piece at 80 feet. Lever breath. Fire. 23 years old. He decided I was too young to know. Too fragile, too much his daughter to be trusted with the fact that he was alive. The rusted plate at 160 feet. Wind down through the notch. Slightly left this morning. Not enough to account for at this range, but enough to note. She adjusted. A quarter turn of the wrist. The kind of adjustment you make after years of making it until it stops being an adjustment and becomes just how you hold the gun. Fire. The plate rang like a bell and spun off the rock. She stood in the notch with the Winchester's smoke curling in the cold air. I would have kept his secret if he'd trusted me with it. If he'd told me what was happening and what he needed and what the cost was going to be. I would have carried it. I'm carrying things right now that most people never get handed. One more wouldn't have broken me. That was the thing her father hadn't understood. Or maybe had understood and decided anyway. She loaded 5 more rounds, worked through them fast, not for accuracy, for speed, for the particular discipline of fast and clean and committed. The discipline that said, when the moment comes, there is no hesitation. There is only what you do. When she was done, she stood in the cooling silence and let herself be angry for exactly 90 seconds. It was a discipline she'd developed over the years. Anger was real. Anger was valid. Anger was also one of the most expensive things you could spend yourself on if you let it run without a budget. 90 seconds. She set it loose. The full force of it. The genuine 4-year weight of grief built on a lie. The genuine fury of a young woman who had remade herself around a loss that wasn't real. Who had reorganized her entire interior life around an absence that had been a choice. Someone else's choice. Made for her without her knowledge or consent. 90 seconds. Then she put it away. Not gone. Not resolved. Just stored properly, where it could wait. She wrapped the Winchester. Put it back. Walked toward town. The sun was beginning to commit. She had work to do. 2:30 came slow. The morning routine. Coffee started. Breakfast rush managed. Ruth moving through the kitchen with her particular focused efficiency. The saloon filling with the midday crowd. Nora moved through all of it on the surface level, while the deeper part of her mind was doing the kind of work that doesn't show. She was thinking about what Cal had told her, and more specifically about what Cal had not told her, because there were gaps. She'd felt them in his narrative, the way you feel a missing stare in the dark. The foot expects contact and finds air, and the whole body lurches to compensate. Cal had told her about the ambush, about running, about 4 years of private reckoning. He'd told her about Frank's survival, about the money, about Merritt's timeline. But he hadn't told her everything he knew about Merritt's operation. She could feel the shape of something larger in what he'd left out. She was also aware of a second thing she needed to do. Maybe needed to do first. 30 miles southwest. The address on Cal's paper. The man who had decided when she was ready. She hadn't decided yet whether she was going to go before or after she knew everything Cal knew. There was an argument for before. Go see her father with a clear head before whatever came. Next complicated everything further. There was an argument for after. Know the full picture first, then decide how to factor in the man who'd arranged that picture from a distance for 4 years. She was leaning toward after, because after was what her father would have advised. Know the terrain. Understand the situation. Then move, which was, she recognized with something that was almost amusement, an extremely inconvenient time to take her dead father's advice. When he wasn't dead. When his advice was the thing she was, simultaneously following and being furious at him for giving, she dried a glass. The door opened. 3 men she didn't recognize. Not minors. Not from town. Something in the way they moved said they'd arrived recently and were still locating themselves in the space. She noted them, filed them, continued drying the glass. Cal Briggs came in at 2:30 exactly. Corner table. Ruth brought his whiskey without being asked. Nora waited 4 minutes. She had a table to clear first. A habit she hadn't broken because breaking habits drew attention. Then she went to his corner. She sat down without ceremony. You didn't tell me everything. Cal looked at her. Something in his expression that might have been relief. No, I didn't. Start with what you left out. He picked up the whiskey glass, set it down. His hands were doing better this morning. Less shaking. Or the shaking was smaller. Controlled by whatever internal negotiation a man makes with his own body when he's decided to do something that matters. Merritt's land operation. You understand the basics. The bank loans. The foreclosure mechanism. The territorial judge. Yes. What you don't know is the scale of it. It's not 8 families, Nora. 8 families is the last move. He's been doing this for 3 years in this county alone. 47 properties. 31 families displaced. Some moved to Tucson. Some went back east. Some of them just stopped being mentioned. She was still, and Copperhead Flats is not the only place. 3 other towns in Arizona territory where Douglas Merritt has banking interests and land interests and a particular relationship with the local legal infrastructure. This county, Pinal County, Graham County. He paused. The number of families across all of it is closer to 200. The number sat on the table between them like something physical. 200 families. And Frank knew this. Frank was building a case that would address all of it. Not just Copperhead Flats. All of it. The territorial judge, the legislators, the network. The whole thing at once so there'd be no piece that could survive by cutting off another piece. Cal's voice was steady, but the effort of keeping it steady was visible. He was 2 years into that case when they hit us on the road. And the case. Gone. Or mostly gone. The documentation he had was in his saddlebag. When I went back the next morning, his horse was gone. Bag and all. If Merritt's men found it, and they were probably looking, then most of what Frank had built was lost. Mostly gone, she said. You said mostly. Cal looked at her. A slight pause. Frank kept copies. Not everything, but some of it. The most critical pieces. The direct evidence linking Merritt to Judge Carr. The bank records that showed the pattern. He kept copies because Frank was the kind of man who assumed everything could go wrong and prepared accordingly. He paused again. He gave me one set. 3 months before the ambush. In case something happened to him. She looked at him. You have them. I've had them for 4 years. And you've been, she stopped herself. Started again. More controlled. You've been sitting on them. For 4 years, I didn't know what to do with them. The simplicity of it. The devastating honesty of an old man. Saying a true thing that was also a terrible thing. Without Frank. Without someone who understood the full case and could present it to the right authority in the right way. The documents were dangerous, but not useful. Merritt has enough influence in the territory that handing them to the wrong person would have made the problem worse. And he stopped. You ran, she said. Not cruel. Just precise. I ran. And then I resigned. And then I spent 4 years being a man who ran. Which is not a condition that makes a person confident in their own judgment about who to trust. Silence. Outside, a wagon went past. Iron wheels on packed earth. A rhythm the town ran on. Where are the documents? My room at the boarding house. Third board from the door, left side. He looked at her. Same place you keep your Colt. She stared at him. He almost smiled. Something at the corner of his mouth that acknowledged the absurdity of the moment without quite committing to finding it funny. I've been doing this for 40 years. I know where people keep things. Nora sat back. Looked at the ceiling. Looked back at Cal. The documents are enough. If we get them to the right authority. Zan Tidball, Cal said. U.S. Marshal, District of Arizona. Out of Tucson. He took over the appointment last month. October 1st. He's not Merritt's man. He's new enough that Merritt hasn't had time to arrange his relationship with him yet. How do you know he's clean? Because Frank told me to watch for him. 3 years ago, Frank sent me a message. Through the same route as the money. Said when Tidball gets the appointment, that's when. He'd been tracking Tidball for years. Believed he was the right man. She thought about this. Her father, somewhere 30 miles southwest. Sending money through Cal. Sending messages through Cal. Watching the political appointments of the Arizona territory from a distance. Positioning everything for this moment. When she's ready. He knew Tidball was getting the appointment, she said. He seemed to. And he knew Merritt was going to move on the last 8 families now. Seems like. Which means he's been watching this from wherever he is for 4 years and moving pieces into position. She paused. And I'm one of the pieces. Cal was quiet. Am I wrong? She said. You're not wrong about the fact, Cal said carefully. I think you might be wrong about the intent. Explain. A man who's moving pieces doesn't set them up and then stay away. He directs them. He communicates. He makes sure they do what he needs them to do. He looked at her. Your father has not been in contact with you once in 4 years. Not directly. Everything he's sent has been through me, structured so it arrives at your door only when you're ready to open it. That's what I just said. He's been protecting you. There's a difference between protecting a piece and caring for a person. I've known Frank Kane for 13 years. I know the difference in his behavior between those two things. He paused. He loves you. He's done a terrible job of showing it. But that's what this is. She looked at him for a long moment. The thing behind her eyes doing something she wouldn't let reach her face. That's almost convincing. I know. He still made a decision that wasn't his to make. Yes, he did. And I'm still angry about it. You're entitled, but... She stood up. Cal looked up at her. But it doesn't change what needs to happen in the next 3 days. We get the documents to Tidball. We stop the foreclosure proceedings. And then... She stopped. And then I go 30 miles southwest, and I have a very long conversation with my father. Cal nodded, slowly. What do you need from me? Tonight, everything. Every document, every piece of evidence you've been carrying for 4 years. Lay it out for me. I need to understand what we have, what we're missing, and what the path to Tidball looks like. All right? And Cal. He looked up. I need to know one more thing. Pause. The 3 men who came in at noon. The ones I don't recognize. Who are they? Cal was very still for a moment. Where are they sitting? Left side. Middle table. The one with the bad leg on the east side. Another stillness, shorter. I don't know them. Which means Merritt brought them in. Which means he's moving faster than 3 days, she said. Not a question. Cal picked up his whiskey. Drank it. Set the glass down with a steadiness that took effort. Maybe tonight. My room. 9 o'clock. Bring everything. She walked back to the bar, picked up a clean glass, began to dry it. She did not look at the 3 men at the middle table, but she knew exactly which one of them had shifted in his seat when she walked past. The afternoon went slowly in the way afternoons. Before action always goes slowly. Time doesn't speed up for drama. It drags. It fills itself with the ordinary in a way that feels almost insulting. The ordinary going on, indifferent to whatever is gathering underneath it, while the person waiting for the moment stands in the middle of normal life and feels the gap between the surface and the depth like a physical pressure. She carried trays, dried glasses, took orders, made change, and watched the 3 men. They were careful. That was the first thing to note. More careful than Merritt's usual people. The men Merritt usually sent were the kind who wore their authority like an advertisement, loud, taking up space, making sure everyone in the room understood the hierarchy without being told. A particular kind of confidence that came from never having faced real consequences. These 3 were different. They drank moderately, talked to each other in voices too low to carry, did not make eye contact with anyone, and they watched the room in a way that was professional. Not miners, not ranchers, not the standard, hired roughness that small-town power accumulated. These were men who had done careful work before, which meant Merritt was escalating. She thought about the 8 families. She didn't know them personally. 14 months of careful social distance. Partly practical, partly because closeness complicated the kind of patience she was practicing. But she knew their names the way you know the names of people in a town when you work in its saloon. The Ferris family north of town. Young Lottie Ferris's people. 4 years on that land. 1 more year, and they'd have met the homestead provisions. The Reyna brothers. Augusto, who ran the smithy, and his brother Marco, who ran a small cattle operation, and 6 others. Variations on the same story. People who had come to this valley before the copper boom, before the railroad, before Douglas Merritt understood the math and started doing arithmetic with their lives. They were going to lose everything. Unless. She dried the glass. Set it down. Not arrogance, just arithmetic. The same arithmetic Merritt used, turned around. He has 3 imported professionals, and his usual people, and a judge in his pocket, and a banking mechanism designed specifically for this outcome. What does the other side have? Cal Briggs, 66 years old, with a shaking hand. Augusto Reyna, who she hadn't spoken to but had observed for 14 months, and who had the calm, considered quality of a man who had worked hard his whole life and still believed that hard work meant something. Lottie Ferris, who she hadn't spoken to either, but who she'd watched carry water from the well on the east side of town every other morning for 14 months with a cheerful efficiency that was either genuine optimism or a very good performance of it. And herself, the nameless girl from the Pale Horse. It wasn't much, but it was what there was. At 4:30, Wade Merritt came back. Not to the bar, not to order a drink or make trouble. He came in through the front door with the particular purposefulness of a man executing an instruction he'd been given, moving with more direction than he usually had but less understanding of where the direction was supposed to go. He looked around the room, found her behind the bar, walked over. She watched him come, kept her hands busy with a glass she'd already dried, let him arrive on his own timeline. He stopped at the bar, put both hands on the edge of it, leaning forward slightly, taking up the space between them, the way people with size often did without thinking. The bruise on her cheek had faded to almost nothing. A shadow. Less than that. She didn't look at him. She looked at the glass. I need to talk to you. I'm working. It won't take long. She set the glass down, picked up another, looked at him. Talk then. He shifted. He'd expected something else. Flinching, maybe. Or anger. Something he could respond to with the script he'd been carrying since he walked in. What he got was a woman looking at him with the calm attentiveness of someone waiting for the interesting part to start. About yesterday, he said. What about it? I... He stopped. Started again. My shirt was ruined. She looked at him. He had the grace to hear how that sounded. Something moved across his face. Not quite shame. Not quite awareness. Something younger than both. Something trying to find its way toward one of them and hadn't arrived yet. I didn't mean, Mr. Merritt. She set the glass down, folded her hands on the bar, looked at him directly. What is it you came here to say? He was quiet for a moment. Something in the direct attention of her, the steadiness of it, the absolute absence of any performance, seemed to derail whatever he'd prepared. My father wants to speak with you. Douglas Merritt. He says he knows who you are. He'd like you to come to his office. There it was. She felt it in the room. Not in her face. Not in her hands, which stayed where they were. Just in the interior of her. The particular alertness of a body that has been waiting for a specific thing and recognizes it when it arrives. Your father, she said. He says he knows who you are. She looked at Wade Merritt, 24 years old, carrying a message he didn't understand from a man whose business he also didn't fully understand. She looked at his face. He didn't know. He had no idea what his father actually did. What those end land contracts actually cost the people they landed on, which was its own kind of information. Tell your father that I appreciate the invitation, and that I'll give it some thought. Wade stared at her. He said, I heard what you said, he said. She picked up the glass again. I'll give it some thought. He stood at the bar for another few seconds, uncertain what to do with an answer that wasn't the answer he'd been prepared for. Then he straightened up, turned around, walked out. The door closed behind him. In the far corner, Cal Briggs set his whiskey glass down with careful precision. Merritt knew who she was. That changed things. Or rather, it confirmed that things were already changed. The three men at the middle table. The personal summons through his son. Merritt was moving. He was not waiting for 3 days. He was moving now, with the particular efficiency of a man who had decided that waiting was a greater risk than acting. She had until tonight, maybe less. She set the glass down, walked to the end of the bar, caught Ruth's eye. I need an hour. Ruth looked at her, looked at the door Wade had just gone through, looked back at Nora. Kitchen's clear. Nora went to the kitchen, stood at the kitchen table and thought. Fast. Clear. Without the luxury of 90 seconds of anger this time. She thought about what she had, what she needed, what the next 12 hours required. There were people in this town who were going to lose their land in the next 48 hours unless something different happened. She'd been thinking of this as her problem, her father's problem by extension. And it wasn't. It was their problem, their land, their 4 years of work and hope and commitment to a piece of ground in a valley in Arizona territory they had chosen to make their home. Maybe it was time to stop being nobody. She went back behind the bar. Ruth, do you know Augusto Reyna? Ruth looked at her. The question was not what she'd expected. I know him. Is he trustworthy? Ruth thought about it. The real answer, not the fast one. He's honest, which isn't always the same thing. But in his case, I think it is. Does he come in here? Thursdays, usually. For the cornbread. A pause. You could try the smithy. Nora nodded, untied her apron. I'll be back by supper rush. Ruth watched her go. Did not say a word, which was, Nora had learned in 14 months, Ruth Gaines' particular way of saying, I trust you. Go. The smithy was on the south end of town. A large building, containing the furnace and workspace, an accumulated inventory of a man who made and repaired everything from horseshoes to barrel hoops to the iron fittings on mine equipment. Augusto Reyna was 44 years old, large in the way of a man whose body had been shaped by 40 years of physical work into something functional and considerable. His hands, currently holding a length of iron bar over a coal fire with long tongs, were the hands of someone who had spent 40 years in proximity to heat and pressure, and the kind of labor that leaves permanent marks. He had a face that was comfortable with silence. He looked up when she came in, registered her with a slight shift of attention, looked back at the iron, made an adjustment, then pulled it from the fire and set it on the anvil. Pale horse girl, he said. Not dismissive, just identifying. Yes, I need to talk to you. He looked at her more fully. Whatever he saw made him set the tongs down. He gestured toward a low wooden bench along the near wall. She sat. He stood with his arms folded, the fire at his back, the comfortable, unconscious posture of a man in his own space. About your brother's land. Something moved in his face. Not surprise. He'd been waiting for something like this. The way that people who know trouble is coming develop a particular vigilance, but a focused attention. What about it? Merritt is moving. Not in 3 days now. Today. She watched his face. Steady. He has men in town I haven't seen before. He summoned me through his son this afternoon, which means he knows something about who I am, which means his operation is less secure than thought, which means he's going to accelerate. Augusta was quiet for a moment. Who are you? Not hostile. Genuine. The daughter of the man who was building a case against Douglas Merritt 4 years ago. The man who got ambushed on a road outside Tombstone and disappeared. A longer silence. Iron Cane, Augusto said quietly. She looked at him. My father talked about him. When I was young. Before we came north. There were stories. A marshal who went after the men behind the men, who understood what it cost small people when big people decided the law was theirs to arrange. He paused. My father said, men like that were rare. He's not dead. He survived. He's been somewhere else. For 4 years. And he had documentation of what Merritt has done, is doing. And that documentation is available to me. If I can get it to Zan Tidball, the new U.S. Marshal in Tucson, before Merritt files his foreclosure papers, there's a chance to stop this. Augusto looked at her for a long time. A chance, he said. Yes, a chance. Not a certainty. What do you need from me? She took a breath. 2 things. First, I need someone who knows this territory. The land between here and Tucson. The routes, the timing. 90 miles to Tucson, he said. Fast rider. 1 long night. Good horses. We may not have 3 days. He nodded. Slowly. Working through it. The second thing. I need to know about the families. The 8 families Merritt is moving on. I need to know if any of them have anyone who can document the loan terms they were given. Anyone who kept records. Augusto looked at the fire for a moment. Ferris. The old man. Henry Ferris. He kept every piece of paper he ever signed. His daughter Lottie has been telling him for years it was obsessive. He'd say, a man who doesn't keep records doesn't know what he owns. A slight pause. He was right. Can you get to him today? Yes. Without Merritt's people seeing. He thought about it. There's a trail east of the creek that comes out north of the Ferris property. Not a road. Not on any map Merritt would have. My brother and I used it to move cattle. Good. I need the papers. Whatever Ferris has. Tonight. Augusto looked at her. You're moving fast. Merritt's moving faster. We're catching up. He picked up the tongs. Set them down again. His version of thinking. The hands moving toward the familiar work while the mind processed the unfamiliar problem. All right. She stood up. One more thing. He looked at her. Lottie Ferris. How fast does she ride? Lottie Ferris was 19 years old, and she did not have any interest in being managed. This was both a problem and an asset, and it was the kind of person who was both at the same time that you had to decide about quickly. They met at the back of the general goods. Augusto had arranged it with an efficiency that suggested he'd been thinking about something like this for a while. Lottie arrived 2 minutes before Nora did, which told Nora something about her. Small. Smaller than Nora, which was saying something. Red hair in a practical braid. A face young enough to be underestimated and watchful enough to resent being underestimated. Riding clothes, good boots, hands with work on them. She looked at Nora for about 4 seconds. You're the one from the Pale Horse. Yes. Augusto said you know who's coming for our land. Yes. Then talk fast. My father's alone and I don't like being away from him right now. She talked fast. The situation laid out with the precision she applied to everything that mattered. No more detail than necessary. No less than useful. Merritt, the foreclosure mechanism, the documents, Tidball, the timeline. Lottie listened without interrupting. Her face did things while she listened. Small quick reactions. Not performed. Just real. And by the time Nora finished talking, she had gone through at least 4 distinct emotional states and arrived at something that looked like decision. What do you need me to do? Ride to Tucson. Pause. Alone? No. With Cal Briggs. He's a former deputy U.S. Marshal with documents that need to reach Tidball. You know the routes. He has the authority, or enough of it to get Tidball's attention. Lottie thought about this. Cal Briggs. Old man. Corner of the Pale Horse. Yes. He shakes. He's been doing this job for 40 years. His hands remember even when the rest of him doesn't. Lottie was quiet. My father's papers. Augusto mentioned them. Yes. Whatever he has that documents the original loan terms. Any correspondence with the bank. Any record of the payments he's made. It all goes with Briggs. To Tidball. To Tidball. Lottie looked at the back wall of the general goods. At a row of flour sacks and a shelf of lamp oil, and the dust that accumulated at the base of everything in a dry climate town, no matter how often you swept. She looked at these things the way people look at ordinary objects when they're making a decision that isn't ordinary. What are you going to be doing? I'm going to be here. Making sure Merritt can't move before Tidball gets the information. That sounds dangerous. Probably. You're not going to tell me how dangerous. No. Lottie looked at her. Something in the looking, assessing. Not unkind. How old are you? 27. You seem older. I've had reasons. Lottie almost smiled. Just the corner of it. They're and gone all right. I'll talk to my father about the papers. And I'll go. A pause. But Briggs has to keep up. He'll keep up. You sure about that? No, but he's motivated. She was back at the Pale Horse before the supper rush. Tied her apron. Took a tray. Moved through the crowded room with the particular invisibility she'd cultivated for 14 months. Except, the three men at the middle table were still there. Different drinks. Same table. Different positions among themselves. But still there. Still watching. Still careful in their carefulness. And now she was watching them too. In the same peripheral way she watched everything that mattered. In the way her father had taught her, never let what you're watching know you're watching it. She cataloged them properly this time. The first man. Heaviest of the three. Close-cropped gray hair. A jacket slightly wrong for the climate. Right-handed. She could tell from the way he reached for his glass. The slight lean. The positioning of the shoulder. The second man. Younger. Maybe 35. Lean in the particular way of men who move a lot and sleep irregularly. He was the one who'd shifted when she walked past earlier. She filed that. Not threat necessarily, but awareness. The most alert of the three. The third man. Oldest. Maybe 50. The quality of patience in the way he sat. Like a man who had learned over many years of doing this kind of work, that the most important skill was simply being willing to wait longer than the other person. Professional, all three of them. Which meant Merritt was treating this seriously. Which meant he knew something she didn't, or thought he did. She walked back behind the bar. Ruth was there. Briggs needs to go tonight, Nora said quietly. Ruth absorbed this. You spoke to Raina and the Ferris girl. Ruth was quiet for a moment. You're not going with him? No. Another quiet moment. You're going to be here, Ruth said. When Merritt moves. Yes. Alone. Cal will leave me his Schofield. I'll have the Colt and the Winchester in the notch. She paused. I'll have Augusto. Ruth looked at her. The expression of a woman doing the math and arriving at a number she didn't like, but who was also old enough to know that the math was the math, regardless of how she felt about the result. There's something I should tell you, Ruth said. Quiet. Deliberate. Nora waited. When you first came in, 14 months ago, I didn't ask your name because I'd been told not to. The money came a week before you arrived, and the notes said don't ask her name. I know. There was a second letter. I didn't show you that one. Nora stilled. From the same hand? Yes. What did it say? Ruth looked at the bar surface for a moment, then looked up. It said, if a time comes when she needs to know who she is, tell her she's the best of what Frank Kane was, and that everything he did badly and with the best intentions he had. Silence. The saloon was full and noisy around them. Completely oblivious. Two men arguing about ore quality. A trio playing cards badly and cheerfully. He wrote that, she said. Yes, 4 years ago. The letter came with the first payment. Before you arrived, she stood still for a moment. The noise of the saloon around her. The smell of wood smoke and whiskey. He prepared everything. He thought of everything. He prepared the money and the address and the second letter and the timing. And then he stayed 30 miles away and waited to find out if his preparation was enough. That is both the most loving and the most infuriating thing I have ever heard of anyone doing. I am my father's daughter. Thank you, she said to Ruth, for keeping it. I thought about giving it to you 100 times. Decided each time it wasn't the right moment. When did you decide it was? Ruth smiled. Just slightly. When you stood up straight after that slap, and your hand went to your hip, and you put it back without touching anything. She looked at Ruth. That's when I knew you were ready, Ruth said. She changed the meeting time. Not 9 o'clock, 7:30, because the three men at the middle table had started their second round of drinks. The kind of thing men do when they're settling in for a long evening rather than leaving, which meant they were watching for something, which meant doing the meeting at 9 was too late. She sent word to Cal through Vickers, the miner who owed her nothing but goodwill, which in her experience was the most reliable currency. The message was simple now. Pale Horse Kitchen. Come through the back. Cal came through the back at 7:45. Documents under his coat. She could see the slight bulk of them, wrapped in oilskin, the way a man wraps paper he's been keeping safe for a long time. He sat at the kitchen table. She closed the door to the main room, lit the second lamp. He laid them out. She'd expected documents, ledger pages, affidavits, the kind of paper evidence that a lawman built a case from. What she got was all of that and more. Frank Kane had been building a case for 2 years before the ambush. The copies Cal had carried were a subset of the full documentation, but a subset chosen with precision, the most critical evidence. The pieces that by themselves established the essential crime, fraud, conspiracy, bribery of a territorial judicial officer. There was a ledger. Partial. 3 pages. But the 3 pages that mattered. Columns of numbers in what she recognized as bank accounting notation. Not the notation of an official bank ledger. The notation of a shadow ledger. Money moving from accounts associated with Merritt's bank to accounts associated with, if you knew how to read the obfuscation, the personal finances of Judge Aldous Carr. There was a sworn statement, notarized in Tucson, from a bank clerk named Thomas Wells. Wells had worked for Copperhead Bank in 1880. He described in careful detail the mechanism by which loan contracts were structured to enable default at Merritt's discretion. He named specific contracts, named specific borrowers, and there was a letter, not from Frank, from a man named Harold Buford, a railroad right-of-way agent for the Southern Pacific, written to a colleague in San Francisco, describing in the corporate euphemism that men use when they want to commit things to paper without quite admitting what those things are. The arrangement between Merritt and the Southern Pacific for land acquisition along the planned siding route. The Southern Pacific was not innocent in this. They'd been buying land from Merritt. Land Merritt had taken from families through the foreclosure mechanism, at prices that made sense only if you understood the land had been acquired illegally. She read through all of it, carefully, without rushing, in the lamplight of Ruth's kitchen. Then she looked up. Wells, the bank clerk. Where is he now? Tucson. He left Copperhead Flats the same year he gave the statement. He's still there. I confirmed it 6 months ago. He'll testify. He agreed to testify when Frank was ready to present the case. Whether he still will, 4 years later, Cal paused. I believe so. He's that kind of man. The letter from Buford. He died in 1881, but the letter is real. I had it verified by a man who knew his handwriting. She looked at the spread of papers on the table. This is enough. Enough to open a federal investigation. Enough for Tidball to move on Merritt. Freeze the foreclosure proceedings while the investigation runs. If Tidball acts fast, she agreed. She began organizing the papers. Carefully. Lottie Ferris and her father's records go with you. You ride tonight. Both of you. East on the creek trail to the Ferris property. She'll be waiting there, with her father's papers. Then south and west toward Tucson. 90 miles, 1 long night with good horses. You don't stop. Cal was quiet for a moment. My horse hasn't done Tucson in 4 years. Reno will give you one of his. He has 2 good animals. Generous. He has 2 brothers whose land is on Merritt's list. So yes, generous and motivated. Cal nodded. What about you? I'm staying here. Merritt knows who you are. I know. Those 3 men, I know. He looked at her, the gray eyes. The old grief that had been working on itself. Something in them now that was different. Not quite resolution, but the shape of it. The beginning of something that might become peace, if things went the right way in the next 48 hours. Your father trusted you to be ready, he said. Quiet. I didn't. I'm sorry for that. She looked at him. Let herself look at him directly, which she'd been managing carefully for 3 weeks. You made it right, she said. That's enough. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he began gathering the papers back into the oilskin. 1 hour, she said. Wait in your room for 1 hour. I need to do something first. What? She stood up. Talk to someone. She went out through the kitchen door and around the back of the building. The night was cold. The desert gives up its heat fast once the sun is gone. By 9 o'clock in October, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees from the afternoon high. She could see her breath. Stars overhead in the particular abundance that only comes at altitude in dry air. She walked south along the alley, to a door she knew because she'd walked past it every morning for 14 months and filed it the way she filed everything. She knocked. 3 seconds, the door opened. Augusto. Reyna looked at her, looked at the night sky behind her, opened the door wider. She stepped in. He closed it. The back of the smithy at night was a different place. The furnace banked. Not cold. Never fully cold. Throwing a dim red glow across the floor. Tools hung in their organized positions along the walls. The anvil sat like a monument in the center of the space. Augusto folded his arms. Waited. Briggs is leaving tonight. With Lottie Ferris. They're going to Tucson. He nodded. Merritt is moving faster than 3 days. Those men in the pale horse. They're not his usual people. He's escalating. What do you need? Tomorrow I'm going to meet with Douglas Merritt. The silence in the smithy was very complete. You said that was a trap, Augusto said. It is a trap. And you're going anyway. Yes. He looked at her, the same steady, unhurried assessment he'd given her this afternoon. Why? Because waiting for him to move is giving him the initiative. And because if I go in there knowing what I know, and if I can hold his attention long enough, it might buy Briggs and Ferris the time they need to get clear for the county. Might. Yes. Augusto was quiet. He unfolded his arms, looked at the anvil. My father used to say, a man who goes into a fire needs to know 2 things. How hot the fire is and where the door is. Good advice. You know how hot the fire is? I have a reasonable estimate. And the door. She almost smiled. I always know where the door is. He looked at her, the furnace throwing red light across his face, making him look older than he was, or maybe more precisely aged. Not old, but seasoned. The particular quality of a man who had paid his prices and was still here. I'll be here. Until you need me. One more thing. The horses. Yes, already done. I spoke to Briggs this afternoon after you left. The bay mare, fast, and she holds her pace. The roan for the girl. They're in the north stall. She looked at him. You spoke to Briggs this afternoon, she said. You were clear about the timeline this morning, I assumed. He made his decision before I asked. He was ahead of the conversation. This is the kind of person worth having beside you. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just don't get killed in that office. She turned toward the door. That's the plan. She went back to the pale horsets, up the stairs, into her room, closed the door. She knelt at the third board from the door, left side, pressed the edges, lifted it. The Colt was there. She picked it up, sat on the edge of the bed with it, held it in the lamplight, and she thought about her father. She thought about him the way she'd been not thinking about him for 4 years. Directly, full on. She thought about the kitchen in New Mexico, the smell of pine and gun oil, his voice. He trained me for this, specifically, deliberately, with this outcome in mind. Every morning in the field behind the house. Every lesson about reading terrain and managing distance and the difference between reacting and deciding. He knew what he was building, and he built it anyway. Was that wrong? She thought about it honestly. I don't know. I think it might have been wrong and also the best thing he could do. Both things at the same time, which is a more complicated answer than I wanted. When I was 23 and angry and certain that everything had a clear moral weight. She was 27 now. She'd learned that complicated was usually more accurate than simple. She checked the Colt. 6 rounds in the cylinder. She knew without checking. She always knew. But she checked anyway, because that was the discipline. No assumptions. Verify. She put it on the bed beside her. She reached into her inner coat pocket and took out the bundle of papers, the receipts, the note, the familiar handwriting. Keep her safe. Don't ask her name. He was afraid. Not of Merritt, or not only. He was afraid of what might happen to her if she came at this too early, too young, too angry, too shaped by the loss rather than by the choice. He was waiting for the anger to become something else. She looked at her hands. Steady. Both of them. Had it. She ran a quick internal inventory, the way she'd been taught. What are you feeling? Name it exactly. Don't round it off. Anger. Yes, still there. Probably always there. Grief. For the 4 years. For the person she'd been in those years. Certain of things that turned out not to be certain. Fear. Present. Appropriate. She'd be a fool not to be afraid going into Merritt's office tomorrow. And underneath all of that, something else. Something that had been there for a long time and was easier to feel now that some of the other things had been named. Purpose. Hers. Not her father's. Not Cal's. Not the thing she'd inherited. Her own. Built from all of this but not owned by any of it. She was doing this because it was the right thing to do. Not because Frank Kane was her father. Not because she'd been built for it. Because 8 families were going to lose their land in the next 48 hours. Unless someone did something, and she was the someone in the position to do it. And that was enough. That was plenty. She put the papers back in her pocket. She lay down on the bed with her boots on, and the Colt beside her, and the lamp turned low. She did not sleep. But for the first time in 4 years, the not sleeping was different. Less like waiting for something terrible. More like a soldier in the last hours before dawn. Clear, quiet, ready. At 10:30, she heard the particular sound of 2 horses leaving by the north side of town. Not loud. Careful. The horses moving at a walk until they were clear of the buildings. The sound of hooves on dirt at a slow pace that gradually grew quieter and then disappeared into the dark. Cal Briggs. Lottie Ferris. Going. She lay still and listened until there was nothing left to hear. Then she got up, checked the Colt again, put it in her coat pocket. Not the holster on her hip, the coat pocket, where it lived when she was being what she was right now, a woman in a town at night who needed to be able to reach a gun without advertising that she had one. She went down the stairs, through the main room, which had thinned considerably. The 3 men at the middle table were gone. That was notable. They'd left somewhere between 9 and 10:30 while she was upstairs. Gone where was the question. She went to the bar. Ruth was there, closing down the last of the evening. The 3 men left, Nora said, hour ago. Paid up and walked out. One of them spoke to Wade Merritt on the street. I saw it through the window when I was putting out the front lanterns. What did they look like, on the street? Ruth thought about it. Like men who'd just been given an assignment. Nora nodded. She stood at the bar for a moment. The empty room around her. The smell of a saloon at the end of its day. Ruth. Ruth looked at her. My real name is Nora Kane. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Carefully. The way she looked at things she wanted to understand completely. I know, Ruth said. Nora looked at her. I figured it out about 2 months in. The way you handle yourself. The things you notice, and she paused. I knew your father a long time ago, briefly. He was the kind of man who left an impression. Everyone says that. It's true. Nora picked up a glass from behind the bar, just to have something in her hands. He's alive. He faked his death. He's been somewhere southwest of here. For 4 years. Ruth looked at her. Then at the glass in Jorah's hands. Then back up. How do you feel about that? Carefully. Like a woman who understood that the question was bigger than it sounded. I'm working on it. Ruth nodded. Keep the kitchen door unlocked. And if I'm not back by noon, you'll be back by noon. Not dismissive. Certain. You're your father's daughter, but you're your own person. That's a better combination than either one alone. She stood at the bar for a moment. In the quiet, empty room. In the particular stillness of a place that had held many lives and was holding hers now. I have been nobody in this town for 14 months. I have been the girl with no name who carries trays and dries glasses and is not worth watching. Tomorrow I'm going to be someone else. She didn't know exactly who yet. She was going to find out. She turned and walked upstairs. She was awake before the rooster. Of course she was. She lay still for the last few minutes of dark and ran through everything. The documents. Gone with Cal and Lottie. 11 hours toward Tucson by now. Good horses. The trail south. 90 miles. Lottie knew the routes. Cal had the authority. Augusto in the smithy. The kitchen door. The Colt in her coat. And Merritt in his office at the Copperhead Bank. Waiting for her to come. Or not waiting. Moving on his own schedule. I don't know which way he'll move first. That's the uncertainty I can't plan around. So she would move first. She got up. Dressed with the economy of someone who has learned to be efficient about everything. The coat, the boots, the Colt checked and pocketed. She went to the window and looked at the dark street below. The first gray of dawn, starting at the eastern edge of the sky, she thought about going to the notch, decided against it. Today was not a day for the rifle. Today was a day for everything else. She went downstairs, made coffee. The sound and smell of it the same as every other morning. The routine intact. The surface of things presenting their ordinary face. She drank the coffee, standing at the kitchen counter, looking at the window, watching the gray become pale blue, become the first real light. Today, she set the cup down. She untied her apron. She'd put it on from habit, this morning of all mornings. Hung it on its hook. She put on her coat, straightened it, felt the weight of the Colt in the pocket. I am about to walk into Douglas Merritt's office. I am about to sit across from the man who arranged to have my father killed. Who thought he had my father killed? And I am going to hold his attention. I am going to be something in that room that he cannot account for, and cannot dismiss, and cannot manage. I am going to be exactly what my father built, and what I have made of what my father built. She went out through the kitchen door. The street was just beginning to stir. Mine wagons coming through on the east side. The bakery chimney. The rooster at the livery. Ordinary. She walked north along the main street toward the bank. Boots quiet on the boards of the walkway. Hands loose at her sides. Breathing even and controlled. The morning air cold in her lungs. Somewhere southwest of here. A man who loves me badly, and with the best intentions he had, is going to find out in the next 24 hours whether everything he prepared was enough. I hope so. For both our sakes. She stopped in front of the Copperhead Bank. Brick. The most substantial structure in Copperhead Flats by a considerable margin. 2 stories. Iron bars on the lower windows. A sign above the door in the clean lettering of a man who wanted to project permanence. The door was unlocked. Already open for the morning. A lamp burning inside. She stood on the step for a moment. This was the moment. This was the place where everything so far became either preparation or waste, where 14 months of invisible patience either counted for something or didn't. She thought of Cal's shaking hands, of Lottie riding south in the dark, of Augusto at his furnace, of Ruth behind her bar, of 8 families on their land, waking up this morning, not knowing whether they'd still be on it by tonight. I am not doing this for my father. Or not only. She pushed open. She went in. Douglas Merritt was behind the main counter, standing, looking over a paper in his hands. He looked up when she came in, smaller than she'd expected. That was always the first thing. Men who had large presences in a town, who occupied so much of the social architecture, were often surprisingly small when you stood in the same room with them. Medium height. The silver hair, immaculate. The vest and jacket of a man who wore them as a statement rather than a convenience. The gold watch chain. He looked at her with the careful attention of a man who has been told something about someone, and is now cross-referencing the information against the reality. Miss Kane, he said. The name in his mouth. Her name. Her real name. Not girl. Not the pale horse girl. Not nobody, Mr. Merritt. He set the paper down, gestured toward the inner office. A room visible through the door. A large desk and 2 chairs. She went in. She took the chair nearest the door. Of course she did. He noticed. She saw him notice. She let him notice. This was information she was giving him deliberately. I know the rules of this room. And the information was part of the message. He sat behind the desk. For a moment neither of them said anything. And in that moment, Nora Kane, the daughter of Iron Frank Kane, the woman nobody had seen for 14 months, the nameless girl who dried glasses and carried trays in a saloon in southeastern Arizona Territory, looked at the man who had arranged her father's murder, who had built a system that ground up families and spat out land, who was even now preparing to take 8 more properties from 8 more people who had done nothing wrong except stand between him and something he wanted. She looked at him, and she decided that she was going to be in this room for as long as it took, because southwest of here, 2 horses were moving toward Tucson, because a man named Zan Tidball had a job to do, and because in this room she had a job too. She held Douglas Merritt's gaze. She waited for him to speak first. He laced his fingers together on the desk. There was a practiced quality to his stillness. Not uncomfortable. Not performing comfort. Just settled in the way of a man who had learned that the person who needs the silence to end first is usually the person with less leverage. He thought he had more leverage. He didn't know yet. You've been in my town for 14 months, he said. I've been in Copperhead Flats for 14 months. I wasn't aware it was yours. Something moved in his face. The faintest acknowledgement. A man recalibrating slightly. Figure of speech, of course. A pause. You know who I am, he said. I know who you say you are. Another recalibration. Smaller. I know who your father was, he said. Is, apparently. The reports of his death were creative. Yes. Do you know where he is? She held his gaze. Do you? He smiled. A real smile. Not warm, but genuine. The smile of a man who has encountered something that does not bore him. I had him found. About 2 years ago. I know where he is. I've known for 2 years. Her interior went very still. Her face showed nothing. And you haven't moved on him? No. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because Frank Kane is not my problem anymore. He was my problem when he was building a K6 me. He stopped being my problem when he stopped building it. Whatever he's doing now, wherever he is, he's not a threat. He's a man living quietly, minding his own business, having made his peace with the fact that some things are larger than one man's crusade. He doesn't know about Cal's documents. He doesn't know about Tidball. Good. You think he gave up, she said. I think he made a sensible decision. When you can't win, you adapt. Is that what you do? It's what I've always done. Without embarrassment. Just a statement about how the world worked in his experience. Why am I here? Because you've been in my town for 14 months, which tells me you came here for a reason. And because whatever reason you came for, I'd rather know what it is than not know. You're a man who likes to know things. I'm a man who has survived a long time by understanding what I'm dealing with. Uncertainty is expensive. So I invited you to come talk, and you came. He paused. Which tells me something. What does it tell you? That you want something. Not just revenge. If revenge was what you wanted, you've had 14 months of opportunity. Not just to watch, because watching from a saloon doesn't accomplish much. You want something specific. And you came to this meeting, which means you think this meeting might be part of getting it. She looked at him. He was not stupid. She'd known going in. You don't build what he'd built with a simple mind. But knowing it and experiencing it in the same room were different things. You're going to foreclose on 8 families today. Or try to. By this afternoon. Confirming it. Not bothering to deny it. They've done nothing wrong. They've failed to meet the terms of their loan agreements. The pleasantness of a man who has said this sentence many times, and found that pleasant delivery softens the resistance. The terms were written to ensure failure. All loan contracts have terms. The terms were agreed to by people who couldn't afford lawyers to read them. That, Merritt said, is an unfortunate asymmetry that exists throughout the American economy. I didn't create it. You use it. Yes, simply without apology. The way every bank in this country uses it. The way every man who has built anything of significance uses what's available to him. She looked at him. That's what you believe, she said. That's what's true, he said. They looked at each other across the desk. And in that moment, she understood something about Douglas Merritt that made him simultaneously more comprehensible and more frightening. He wasn't lying. He wasn't performing. He actually believed what he was saying. He had organized his world around a set of premises that were internally consistent and that produced, from his perspective, a coherent picture of how things worked and what was fair and what wasn't. He had decided that the law was a tool for those who knew how to use it, that the people who didn't know how to use it were the ones who suffered, and that this was the natural order of things rather than a moral failure. And he had been living inside that decision for so long that it had become invisible to him. It was just how things were. That was what made him dangerous. Not the greed. Greed was understandable. Anger at something you understand is manageable. This was something harder. This was a man who had found a way to be comfortable. What do you want from me? She said. Nothing dramatic. I want you to understand the situation. I want you to know that your father has made his peace with it, and I want you to consider that the same accommodation is available to you. She stared at him. I'm offering you the recognition that you are Frank Kane's daughter, which means you are a person of some capability, and that capability has value in the right application. I have need of people who can manage situations. Discreetly. I pay well, and in exchange, the situation as it stands. Your presence here, your father's location, remains as it is. There it was. Not a threat. Not exactly. A negotiation. The particular offer of a man who preferred to incorporate threats rather than execute them. He was offering her a job, and using her father as the implicit collateral. She thought, he's been in control of every conversation he's had for 20 years. He's never sat across from someone who was doing what I'm doing right now. He thinks this is a negotiation. He doesn't know this is a delay. I'll need time to consider it. He nodded. Of course. How much time do I have? He looked at his watch. The foreclosure papers go to Judge Carr's office at 3 this afternoon. Before that, I'm open to further conversation. 3 o'clock. Cal and Lottie had left at 10:30 the previous night. 11 hours ago, 90 miles. Lottie knew the routes, fast horses from Augusto. Dawn arrival in Tucson maybe slightly after. Tidball would be at his desk. She needed more time. The 8 families. If I were to agree to your proposition, what happens to them? He looked at her. They lose the land. That doesn't change. The land is what this is about. I know what it's about. I'm asking about the people. He was quiet for a moment. The first moment of what might have been something other than certainty. They'll be compensated. Fairly. For the improvements on the land. Not the land itself. The land is the point. She looked at her hands in her lap. There is no argument that moves this man. I knew that. I am not here to argue. I am here to watch his face when things start to go wrong. I've been thinking about your offer. And? I have a condition. He looked at her with the faint interest of a man who had expected unconditional yes or unconditional no. The 8 properties. You delay the filing. I've already told you I'm not asking you to cancel. I'm asking you to delay. 2 days. He was still for a moment. Why? Because I need 2 days to settle certain things. My father. I need to contact him. Before I make any agreement that affects his situation, I need to speak with him. You said you know where he is. You haven't moved on him. That tells me he's part of whatever arrangement you're open to. I need 2 days. He processed it. Because it was the one thing he couldn't immediately verify or refute. He knew where Frank Kane was. He didn't know what Frank Kane knew. He didn't know what lines of communication existed between them, and if there was any chance at all, that Frank Kane might be persuaded to formalize his current accommodation, to make it explicit, to put it in a form Merritt could use. 2 days was not a big ask. He was quiet. She held herself perfectly still. 2 days, he said. 2 days. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll delay the filing until Friday, 3 o'clock Friday. She nodded, unhurried, like a woman closing a deal she'd expected to close. Thank you. She stood up. He stood up too. The automatic courtesy of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, to perform the forms of civility with enough consistency that they'd become real, or close enough to real that the difference was invisible. Miss Kane? She stopped. Your father is a man who understood something important. He understood that the world is what it is, not what we'd like it to be. What it is. She turned, looked at him. My father understood something different. What's that? That what the world is and what the world should be are not the same thing, and that the gap between them is not something you accept. It's something you work on. She held his gaze. Every day. For as long as it takes, she went out. She went to the edge of town, sat on a fence rail at the north end of the main street, and waited. For Augusto. He came 8 minutes later, moving fast for a large man. He came to a stop in front of her with an expression that combined urgency with something that was trying not to be excitement. They came out, he said. All three. All three. They went to the bank. The back. Entrance, fast. She nodded. Something had already moved. Something she'd set in motion even before the meeting with Merritt. Because the telegraph office. She'd been thinking about messengers and riders, and the distances between here and Tucson. She'd been thinking in terms of the road, of miles and horses and hours. She hadn't been thinking about the telegraph line that the Southern Pacific had strung along its right-of-way. When it came through, in 1881, the telegraph office in Copperhead Flats was in the station house at the south end of Main Street. One operator. A wire that ran south along the railroad route to Tucson. She looked at Augusto. The telegraph, she said. He went very still. I have the account numbers from the ledger. I read those documents 3 times by lamplight. I know them. A telegraph to Tidball. From someone who identified themselves. Who mentioned the Wells statement by name. Who referenced the specific account numbers. It's not evidence, Augusto said. No, but it's contact. It tells Tidball someone is trying to reach him. It tells him there's a situation in Copperhead Flats that needs his attention. And when Cal arrives with the documents, he's not going to be a stranger with papers. He's going to be the follow-up to a message Tidball already received. She looked at him. The telegraph operator, she said. Pete Swindell, 22 years old. He works for the railroad, the Southern Pacific. She thought about the letter from Harold Buford in Cal's documents. The Southern Pacific thought they were buying land legally. Buford had been acting as an intermediary without fully understanding the mechanism that made the land available. The railroad was another victim of Merritt's fraud, which meant Pete Swindell had no particular reason to protect Douglas Merritt. Take me to the station house. Pete Swindell was 22 years old and in possession of the combination of youth and technical competence that made him good at his job and not much else yet. He looked up when they came in. Help you? I need to send a telegraph to Tucson. To U.S. Marshal Zan Tidball. Official business. Pete looked at her. Looked at Augusto. Looked back at her. You're the pale horse girl. My name is Nora Kane. My father is Frank Kane, former deputy U.S. Marshal under the District of Arizona. I have information relevant to an active federal matter. I need that wire sent. Pete blinked. Then he reached for his key. She dictated carefully. Every word chosen. Every account number she could remember from the ledger, which was most of them. Her father had once said the memory for numbers was the gift that made her dangerous and the burden that made her sleepless. 300 words. Pete charged by the word. She paid from the money in her coat pocket. Savings from 14 months of careful living. The message went. Dot and dash, and the particular clicking silence of a wire carrying something important south. Pete looked up when he was done. Tidball's office will receive that within the hour. If he's in. If his operator's at the key. He's new, she said. New men are at their desks. Pete nodded. Anything else? She thought for a moment. If anyone comes in today to send a wire, particularly to any address connected to Judge Aldous Carr or to the Copperhead Bank, I need to know. Pete looked at her. That's not standard practice, no. He looked at the key in front of him, at the wire going south, at the window facing the main street. I don't like that bank. Conversationally, like he was discussing the weather. Most people don't. All right, I'll send word if anything comes through. She went out. Noon came. Then, 1 o'clock. She was in the Pale Horse, behind the bar. Because being behind the bar was the most normal thing she could be doing at 1 o'clock on a Tuesday, and normal was what she needed to project until she couldn't anymore. Ruth came and stood beside her. You went to the bank, Ruth said. Not a question, yes. And he's delaying. Or he was. Pause. He might not be anymore. Ruth looked at the front door, at the main street visible through the window beside it. Augusto came by while you were at the telegraph office. He said to tell you. 2 of the 3 men went back to the boarding house. 1 stayed at the bank. She absorbed this. Merritt's deciding, she said. Between what? Between trusting the delay and acting now. She picked up a glass, turned it in her hands. The telegraph will reach Tidball within the hour, if it hasn't already. If Tidball moves immediately, if he sends something official back on the same wire, then we have something. Something Merritt can't ignore. And if Tidball doesn't move immediately, she set the glass down. Then we wait for Cal. They stood side by side at the bar. The lunch crowd thinned today. Something about the day had transmitted itself to the town the way certain days do. A frequency people could feel without being able to name it. Conversations were shorter. People looked at the street more than usual. The town knew something was in the air. Didn't know what, but knew. At 1:40, Pete Swindell came through the front door of the Pale Horse, moving faster than a 22-year-old telegraph operator usually moved. He came to the bar, reached into his jacket and produced a folded paper. Came back 20 minutes after yours went. From Tidball's office, she took it, unfolded it. Read it again. Ruth watched her face. Well, Ruth said. Nora folded the paper, put it in her pocket. Tidball's moving. He received Cal's documents 2 hours ago. Cal and Lottie made better time than I thought. He's already read the Wells statement. She paused. He's issuing a temporary injunction against any foreclosure proceeding in Copperhead Flats pending federal review. The words in the room. Heavy. Real. A temporary injunction, Ruth said. It means Merritt can't file the papers. Not legally. Not while the injunction is active. And if he files anyway, he's in contempt of federal authority, which is something even Judge Carr can't make go away. Ruth put both hands flat on the bar, then looked up at Nora. Your father's documents. They were enough. They were enough. Combined with Wells being alive and willing to testify. Combined with Cal's testimony about the ambush. Combined with, she stopped. Combined with 4 years of a man sitting on something too heavy and finally setting it down. The injunction would arrive officially in Copperhead Flats within the day. Tidball dispatching a rider with the formal document. But the telegraph confirmation was enough. It was enough to show Merritt. He'll fight it. Of course he will. This isn't over. Not the legal battle. Not the investigation. Not whatever Carr is going to do when federal scrutiny lands on his docket. This is the beginning of the end. Not the end itself. But the 8 families. Today, they kept their land. That's enough. That's enough for today. She went to the bank. Not because she had to. Because she'd told him she'd come back before 3. And she was someone who kept her word even with people who didn't. The one professional still at the bank was in the outer room. He looked at her. Did not stop her. Something in his posture said he'd already received word that the situation had changed. She went into the inner office. Merritt was at his desk. He looked up when she came in. He knew, she could see it in his face. The careful arrangement of a man who has received news he didn't want and is deciding how to present himself in its aftermath. She sat down, same chair. She reached into her pocket, took out the telegraph paper, set it on the desk between them. He looked at it. Did not pick it up. He already knew what it said. When, he said. Cal Briggs reached Tidball this morning. The documents Frank collected 4 years ago. Pause. The copies. Something moved across Merritt's face. The first real thing she'd seen there. Not the performance of certainty. Not the pleasant surface of a man in control. Something underneath that. Frank sent copies with Cal, he said. Yes. I didn't know about the copies. No. He was quiet for a long moment. The injunction is temporary, he said. For now. The investigation could take years. The federal process will take what it takes. But the families keep their land while it runs. She paused. And the pattern is visible now. 47 properties, 3 counties. That's not a local matter anymore. He looked at the telegraph paper. Your father. He planned this. All of it. He started it, she said. I finished it. She paused. We finished it. He looked at her. For the first time since she'd sat down across from him. In this meeting and the first one, she saw something in Douglas Merritt that she hadn't expected. Not defeat exactly. Something more complicated than that. Recognition. The recognition of a man who had just come up against something larger than his calculations had accounted for. Not a gun. Not a threat. Just the truth. Moving at its own pace. Arriving at its own time. Immune to the arrangements he'd made for everything else. Iron Cane, he said. Quiet. Almost to himself. His daughter, she said. She stood up, buttoned her coat. The federal riders will be here by tomorrow morning, with the formal injunction and a set of questions for Judge Carr. She looked at him. I'd suggest you contact your lawyers in Tucson today. He looked at her. Is that your advice? He said. No. That's just what someone who's watched the mechanism for a while would observe. She walked to the door. Miss Kane. She stopped. Did not turn. You're more like him than you know, he said. She thought about that. Maybe? Or maybe I'm exactly what he made, and also exactly what I made of that. And maybe those two things are not in conflict. She didn't say any of it. She went out. She walked for 2 hours after that. Not aimlessly. Nothing she did was aimless. But the walking served a purpose that was harder to name than strategy or preparation. It was the thing she did when she needed to let her body process what her mind had already finished with. And her mind had finished with Douglas Merritt. She stopped at the edge of the creek, looked at the water. Low this time of year, always low in October. A thread of movement over pale stones. The remnant of something more substantial that would return in spring. He believed he was right. That was the thing. That was the core of it. He didn't think he was a villain. He thought he was a realist. And men who think they're realists are the most dangerous kind, because they've done the moral accounting already and signed off on the result. And there's no argument you can make that they haven't already made to themselves and dismissed. You can't convince a man like that. You can only change the mathematics, which was what Cal and Lottie had done, which was what the documents had done, which was what 4 years of a man sitting on something too heavy and finally setting it down had done. She crouched at the edge of the creek, picked up a flat stone, turned it in her hands. The ordinary weight of an ordinary thing. She stood up. The afternoon had gone warm in that particular October way. the early gray burning off into something bright and shadowless, the light making the mountains look closer than they were. She stopped at the front of the pale horse, looked at the sign. The horse that only vaguely resembled a horse. The worn boards of the porch where a tray had been knocked from her hands, and she had picked it up without a word. This is what it looks like when something ends. Not dramatic. Not the way she'd imagined it in the years she'd spent imagining it. Just an afternoon. A main street. A sign, the ordinary world continuing to be itself. She went inside. Ruth was at the bar. Looked up. Looked at Nora's face. Whatever she saw there, she nodded once and turned back to what she was doing. Nora went behind the bar. Picked up a glass. Started to dry it. Tomorrow I ride southwest. 30 miles. To a house with a low roof and a man she has to have a very long conversation with. I am not ready for that conversation. I'm going anyway. Because ready was a luxury. She'd been waiting to be ready for 4 years. And ready had not arrived in any clean form. Ready was just deciding to go. That was all it had ever been. She set the glass down. Picked up another. And outside on the main street of Copperhead Flats, Arizona Territory, on a warm October afternoon in 1882, the town went on being itself. The mine wagons, the smith's hammer, the dog at the livery, the ordinary, unremarkable life of a place that didn't know yet that something had changed inside it. But it had. It had. She left at dawn, told Ruth the night before. Ruth made no argument. Just asked if she was coming back, she said. I don't know yet, Ruth said. The room's yours as long as you need it. Said it like it was simple. Because for Ruth it was, she told Augusto. He walked her to the livery and stood with his arms folded while she saddled the borrowed bay. Marco's land, she said. The injunction covers it. I know. He knows, he cried, a pause. Don't tell anyone. I told you that. She swung up into the saddle. Thank you. For all of it. He looked up at her, the dawn light on his face, the steady quality of him. The man who had been ahead of the conversation, who had saddled horses before being asked, who had trusted her before she'd given him reason to. Tell your father there are people here who remember what he started. She nodded. She turned the horse south and west. 30 miles. The terrain unfolded the way she'd memorized from Cal's description. South through the valley, picking up the dry creek bed that ran southwest, following it through mesquite, and then climbing slightly into the lower hills along the edge of the Galiuro Range. She rode alone, the wind still in the morning cold, the mountains to the east catching the first light. Hawks up, patient. She thought about patience. I spent 4 years being patient, building toward this, and now it's done. Or the first part is done. The most urgent part. The families and the documents in Tidball. And I'm riding toward a conversation I don't have a plan for. Which was new. She always had a plan. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe this is the conversation that gets to be unplanned. The one that happens as it happens, without the managed patience, without the calculated timing. Just 2 people. One with a lot of questions. The other with a lot of years of difficult answers. He's going to apologize. He'll try to explain. And I'm going to let him. Not because the explanation changes what he did, but because I want to hear what he thought he was doing. In his own words. Without the architecture of absence between us. And then I'm going to tell him what I think. All of it. The 4 years. The grief that wasn't real grief. Or was a different kind of real. The 23-year-old who rebuilt herself around a loss that turned out to be a choice. I'm going to tell him exactly what his choice cost. And then. She didn't know what came after then. That was all right. The horse moved under her, steady and willing, and the miles went by in the warming morning. And the mountains caught more light, and the hawks above her stopped waiting for thermals, and just flew. The house was exactly as Cal had described. Low roof, thick walls, adobe. The practical construction of a region that understood temperature. A small corral beside it with 1 horse. A gray. Standing in the morning shade with the patient quality of a horse that didn't get ridden much anymore. She stopped her horse outside the gate. Sat for a moment. The door was closed. No smoke from the chimney yet. He knows I'm here. He has to know. He's been watching this play out. He knows Merritt, knows the timeline, knows that today, the day after, would be the day. She dismounted, tied the horse to the gate post, walked up the short path, knocked. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. The door opened. He was smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing. Children remember their parents as large. as the primary scale against which everything else is measured. She had carried a version of Frank Kane in her memory that was sized to her 8-year-old perception of him. Large, absolute, the fixed point around which the known world turned. The man in the doorway was not that man. 61 years old, thinner through the shoulders, the hair gone from iron gray to white entirely. The limp she'd been told about. Left leg, a hitch in the motion that he'd had long enough that it had become part of how he stood. The hands, the right hand, 2 fingers missing, the ring and the small, lost to the same night that had given him the limp. He'd been called Iron Frank for his shooting. His right hand would never shoot the same way again. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning light between them. The distance of 4 years and 30 miles and decisions made without asking. Say the first real thing, not the managed thing. The first real thing. You're smaller, she said. He blinked. Then something happened in his face. Something that started somewhere behind his eyes and moved forward slowly. The way things move that have been waiting a long time. You're taller, he said. She stared at him. He almost smiled. Something at the corner of his mouth that was either the beginning of one or the memory of them. Come in. I'll make coffee. She went in. The inside was simple. 1 main room. A table. 2 chairs. A stove banked down for the morning. A shelf of books, more than she'd expected. A window on the south side that looked out at the hills. On the table a map. Copperhead Flats. The streets of it. The surrounding terrain. Marked in his handwriting. She looked at the map. He was at the stove, making coffee with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who had done this ritual alone for a long time. You knew it was today, she said. I knew yesterday was the day. I knew today would be after. Tidball moved fast. Tidball is a good man. I watched him for 2 years before recommending him to the right people. He paused. The coffee's ready. He brought it, set a cup in front of her, sat down across the table. The map between them. She looked at it. At Copperhead Flats, laid out in his handwriting. At the streets she'd walked for 14 months. At the position of the bank. At the notch in the ridge east of town where she'd fired Winchester rounds every morning for 14 months. He'd marked the notch. A small notation. A letter N. In the position of the ridge. You knew I was practicing, she said. I know what you are. I know what you do in the mornings. I know because I built it into you. A pause. That's not something I'm apologizing for. She looked up. You're not apologizing for that. No. The skills. The preparation. I'm not sorry for any of that. You needed it. You used it. He looked at her steadily. What I'm sorry for is the other thing. What other thing? Letting you carry a grief that wasn't real. Leaving you alone with that for 4 years. Deciding that your safety mattered more than your truth. He stopped. You're right to know. She held the coffee cup, warm in her hands. You said the choice was mine. In the letter. It was always yours. I was the one who delayed giving it to you. Why 4 years? He looked at the map. Because in the first year I was still recovering. The leg. The hand. I was not functional, in any way that mattered, for most of that first year. He paused. And then when I was functional again, I started watching. Watching you. Watching Merritt. Watching the situation develop. And every time I thought, now, this is the moment to reach out, to tell her. Something would happen. Merritt would make a move. The situation would become more dangerous. And I would decide, not yet. Wait until it's safer. It was never going to be safer. No, I know that now. You knew it then. He was quiet. Yes, I knew it then. She looked at him. At the man across the table from her. 61 years old, missing 2 fingers. A limp he would carry the rest of his life. A man who had been a legend and had spent 4 years being nobody, the same way she'd spent 14 months being nobody, and who was now here, across a table, with coffee between them. The families kept their land, she said. I heard. The investigation into Merritt is federal now. Carr is going to be questioned. The system he built will take time to dismantle, but it will be dismantled. Because of what you started, because of what you finished, he said, precisely, meaning it. She looked at the coffee in her cup. This is the moment. This is where I decide whether the anger gets to be the last word, or whether something else does. He made decisions I didn't consent to. He shaped me toward this outcome without asking me. He traded 4 years of my life for a plan he'd designed without consulting me. And here I am, 27 years old, 8 families with their land, a federal investigation, a man named Cal Briggs who slept through the night for the first time in 4 years. I am angry, and I am not broken, and both of those things are true at the same time. She looked up. I needed a father, she said, not a plan. He held her gaze, didn't look away, didn't flinch from it. I know, he said, you don't get to decide, that's okay. I know that too. I get to decide that. Yes. You do, she wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Outside the morning had gone fully bright. The hills to the south green-gray in the winter's edge light. The gray horse in the corral moving to the water trough. A hawk far up, a dark shape against a blue sky, moving with the unhurried purpose of something that knew exactly where it was going and wasn't in a hurry to arrive. I'm angry, she said. I know. And I'm not done being angry. I'm not asking you to be. But she stopped, thought, started again. But I didn't come here to only be angry. He waited. I came here because you're my father. And because whatever you did, and however you did it, you're still that. And I've had enough of grief that doesn't go anywhere. She looked at him. So, I'm going to finish this coffee. And you're going to tell me what the last 4 years have actually been like. Not the plan. Not the strategy. The actual days. She paused. And then we'll see where we are. Frank Kane looked at his daughter, and for the first time in 4 years, possibly longer, something in his face went from the managed steadiness of a man carrying a burden to something that was just a man at a table, with a second chance he hadn't been sure he'd get. The actual days, he said. All right. He picked up his cup. They were lonely, he said. Simply. That's where I'd start. She nodded. Start there, she said. And the morning went on around them, warm and still. The hawk above the hills, the horse at the trough, the two of them at the table with their coffee going cold, and the conversation finally beginning. 3 days later, she rode back into Copperhead Flats. The town looked the same. Of course it did. 3 days was nothing in the life of a town. The mine wagons east, the bakery smoke, the rooster at the livery. But the Copperhead Bank had a different energy, a closed quality, the particular stillness of a building where the ordinary business has stopped and been replaced by something more complicated and official. A writer from Tucson had arrived the day before with the formal injunction papers. The investigation was underway. Merritt was still in his office, still in Copperhead Flats, not yet under arrest. The investigation was new. The legal process was moving at the pace of the legal process. But everyone in town knew, the way things become known in small places. Not announced, not posted, just somehow understood. The air of the man had changed. She stopped in front of the pale horse. Ruth was on the porch. She looked at Nora, at the set of her shoulders, at whatever was in her face. How was it? Ruth said. Nora thought about the kitchen table, the coffee going cold. Her father's voice, not large, not certain, just honest. Laying out 4 years of lonely days with the plain, unhurried honesty of a man who had decided that accuracy was the only remaining courtesy. She thought about the moment, around noon of the first day, when she'd stopped being angry long enough to tell him something real about her own 4 years, and how the telling of it, the first honest telling of it to anyone, had gone through her like a river through a break in a dam. Not fixed, not healed, but moving finally, in the direction of somewhere. She thought about the second day, the walk they'd taken into the hills, his limping stride and hers steady beside it. Not talking about everything that had happened, talking about hawks, about the particular way the desert smelled after the rare rain, about a book he'd been reading, about nothing important and everything. She thought about the morning of the third day, when she'd saddled up to go back, and he'd stood at the gate of the corral, and she'd looked at him, and he'd said, "Come back when you can, not when you're ready, when you can better." Long, she said to Ruth, and not finished, but started. Ruth nodded. That's usually the best you can ask for. Nora dismounted, the horse toward the livery, then stopped, turned back to Ruth. I'm going to need a few things. Ruth looked at her. What kind of things? Time off. Some of it. My father is going to be called as a witness in the federal case. He'll need to come in. He can't stay in this room. The room's too small. She paused. But he'll need to be somewhere. Ruth was quiet for a moment. There's a room at the end of the upstairs hall. Storage. Has a window. I could clear it in a day. Nora looked at her. He's difficult. He's stubborn, and he's opinionated, and he'll have thoughts about how you run your kitchen. So do I. Mine are usually correct. He'll argue about that. Good, Ruth said. I haven't had a decent argument in years. Nora looked at her, and then, for the first time in longer than she could account for, she laughed, a real one. Brief, slightly startled by itself. There and gone. Ruth raised an eyebrow. That's a good sound. Haven't heard it from you before. Nora shook her head, turned back toward the livery. I'll be back for the evening shift. Take your time. She walked the horse down the main street. The town going on around her, the mine wagons and the bakery smoke, and the ordinary, unremarkable afternoon of a place that was, in small ways, already different from what it had been a week ago. 8 families on their land. An investigation underway. Cal Briggs, somewhere on a road back from Tucson, his step slightly lighter than it had been in 4 years, or so she hoped. Lottie Ferris riding north to her father's property, which was still her father's property, and Nora Kane, daughter of Iron Frank, the woman nobody had seen, the nameless girl from the Pale Horse, walking a borrowed horse down the main street in the afternoon light. Not nameless. Not anymore. The livery appeared. She handed the horse to the boy who worked the afternoon shift. He took the reins without asking anything. She walked back up the main street. The sun was moving toward the mountains, to the west, the light going long and golden, making everything look like it was worth keeping. She stopped in front of the Pale Horse, looked at the sign. The horse that only vaguely resembled a horse. I have been hiding in this building for 14 months, behind its walls, behind the name Nobody, behind the tray and the apron and the face that gave nothing away. That was necessary. And it's over. Now I get to figure out what comes next, which was terrifying, which was good. Terror meant something was real and mattered and had the capacity to go either way. She pushed through the door. The Pale Horse Saloon in the afternoon. The smell of it. The light through the windows. Ruth behind the bar. Vickers in his corner. The card table where the afternoon shift was already starting to gather. Ordinary. All of it ordinary. She tied on her apron, picked up a tray, and outside on the main street the day went on. Simple and unremarkable, and full of the particular grace of ordinary things that are, if you pay attention, never really ordinary at all. They never put her name on anything official in that town. Not on the injunction documents, not in the federal case records, not in the Tucson papers that covered the investigation into Douglas Merritt and Judge Aldous Carr and the network of arranged corruption that had been quietly grinding up small lives in 3 counties for the better part of a decade. She wasn't mentioned. She didn't mind. The families knew. Augusto knew. Cal Briggs knew, and wrote it down in a personal account he never published. Lottie Ferris would find it among his things years later and read it twice and pass it on to her own children. Ruth knew, and Frank Kane knew. He came to Copperhead Flats 6 weeks later, limping, carrying a leather satchel with his testimony materials inside. He ate Ruth's cornbread and argued with her about the beans. She was right about the beans, as it turned out. He came back 3 days later and told her so, which surprised her, which was, in his experience, the best way to start anything worth starting. He and Nora had more of those conversations, the unplanned ones. Some of them ended well. Some of them ended with one of them walking out of the room and not speaking for a day. Some of them were about nothing. Hawks, books, the way the light hit the eastern mountains at certain times of year. And those were sometimes the best ones. It was not repaired between them. It was beginning, and beginning, in her experience, was the most honest place anything had ever started. She stayed in Copperhead Flats through the winter, then the spring, was still there when the federal court issued its first formal ruling in the Merritt case. A partial judgment. More to come. The machinery of law moving at its own pace toward an end she would not rush. Douglas Merritt was still in Copperhead Flats, under different conditions. The bank under federal supervision. The land transactions frozen. His 3 professional men long gone, off to other arrangements. Other men's problems. She passed him occasionally on the main street. He nodded. She nodded back. No more than that. One afternoon in the early spring, when the creek had started to run again and the mountains had gone green at the lower elevations, she went to the notch in the ridge east of town. She didn't bring the Winchester, she just went. She stood in the notch and looked west at the valley below. At Copperhead Flats, spread out along its single road. At the Pale Horse, distinguishable from this height by the particular angle of its sign. At the bank which was still there, which would be there long after the merits of the world had finished their reckoning with the law. She stood there for a long time, not practicing anything, not preparing for anything, just standing in a place she knew well, in the quiet of a morning that asked nothing from her, being the person she was. All of it, the whole complicated accumulation of it, in a world that was not fixed and not finished but was, in small ways that compounded into larger ones, becoming more honest. That was enough. She turned around. She walked back to town, behind the bar by noon, a tray in her hand, her name her own,